On a frozen mountain night in Colorado, Jake Mason, broken, haunted by war, sat with a loaded gun and a letter to his son, seconds from ending it all. Then three desperate strangers pounded on his door, a terrified CEO and her two daughters, running from killers in a snowstorm. The moment he opened that door, four lives collided in ways none of them could predict. What happened next turned a suicide into a siege, a coward into a warrior, and a goodbye letter into a second chance. This is their story, a story of redemption written in gunfire and grace. Stay with me until the end and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind screamed through the pines like a wounded animal, hurling snow against the windows of the cabin with such force that the glass rattled in its frames. Jake Mason didn't hear it anymore. He'd stopped hearing most things 3 weeks ago, around the time the bank took his truck, his business, and the last shred of dignity he'd been clinging to since Kandahar. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace and the small circle of light from the oil lamp on the table. Jake sat motionless in the wooden chair his grandfather had made 50 years ago, staring at two objects laid out before him like sacraments at a twisted altar: a Colt .45 automatic, cleaned and loaded, and a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper, folded once with "For Cody" written across the front in his careful block letters. His hands didn't shake. That surprised him. He'd expected trembling, some physical manifestation of fear or doubt, but there was nothing. Just cold, heavy certainty settling over him like the snow settling over the mountains outside. 10 years since he'd left the Marine Corps. 5 years since the nightmares got bad enough that Emma took Cody and left. 3 years since the construction business failed. 3 months since he'd last seen his son. And tonight, Christmas Eve, though he'd barely registered the date, tonight was the end. Jake picked up the letter, unfolded it, and read his own words for perhaps the 100th time. Cody, I'm sorry doesn't cover it, buddy. I know that. By the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that sometimes being sorry isn't enough. Sometimes the weight gets too heavy, and the strongest thing a man can do is set it down. I want you to know that every bad thing that happened, the drinking, the yelling, me not being there when you needed me, none of that was your fault. You were the best thing I ever did in this life. The only thing I got right. Your mom loves you more than anything, and she'll make sure you grow up good and strong and better than I ever was. Don't remember me like this. Remember the camping trips, the baseball games, the way I used to make you laugh doing that stupid Chewbacca impression. Remember that your dad loved you more than life itself. That part was always true. Be brave, be kind, be the man I couldn't figure out how to be. Love always, Dad. He folded it again carefully and set it back down next to the gun. The letter would be enough. It would have to be. Emma would find it when she came to clean out the cabin. He'd left the deed and keys in an envelope with his lawyer, along with instructions that surprised even him with their thoroughness. For a man planning to eat a bullet, he'd been remarkably organized about the aftermath. The cabin would go to Cody when he turned 18. There was a small life insurance policy through the VA that would pay out for suicide after 2 years. He'd checked, and it had been 4. $25,000. Not much, but enough for college, maybe. Enough to say he'd tried to leave something behind besides wreckage and questions. Jake's hand moved toward the Colt, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip. He'd carried an M9 Beretta in Afghanistan, but this .45 had been his grandfather's sidearm in Korea, handed down like a grim inheritance to the Mason men who went to war and came back changed. His grandfather had died at 78, peacefully, surrounded by family. Jake wouldn't make it to 42. He pulled the slide back slightly, confirming what he already knew. Round in the chamber, safety off. The gun was ready. He wasn't sure he was, but that didn't seem to matter anymore. Outside, the wind rose to a shriek. The temperature had dropped to near 0, according to the last weather report he'd heard 2 days ago, before he'd stopped checking such things. The storm was supposed to be historic. 2 feet of snow, maybe 3, with drifts twice that high. The access road would be impassable for days. No one would find him until after New Year's at the earliest. Good. Let the cold preserve him. Let the snow cover everything white and clean and quiet. Jake raised the gun, the barrel surprisingly warm in his grip despite the freezing cabin. He pressed it against his right temple, angled slightly upward the way he'd been trained. Quick, clean, no room for error. His finger found the trigger, and he closed his eyes. Cody's face in the hospital, minutes after being born. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, squalling and red and perfect. Emma laughing at their wedding, her dress simple, her smile radiant. The mountains outside this cabin at sunrise, painted gold and purple and impossible. He squeezed, bang, bang, bang. The sound exploded through the cabin, and Jake's eyes flew open, his heart lurching sideways in his chest. For one disorienting second, he thought he'd done it, that this was the afterlife, that death sounded like pounding on a door. Then his combat training kicked in, snapping him back to razor focus. Those weren't gunshots. Someone was at the front door. "Please!" A woman's voice, muffled by wind and walls, but desperate enough to cut through both. "Please, someone help us!" Jake lowered the gun slowly, his hand steady even as his mind reeled. No one should be out there. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles down the mountain. The road had been closed since noon. Who the hell? "My daughters are freezing, please!" He was moving before conscious thought caught up, the Marine in him overriding everything else. He set the gun down, grabbed the oil lamp, and crossed to the door in 4 long strides. His hand hesitated on the deadbolt for just a moment, some paranoid corner of his mind wondering if this was a setup, a robbery, something worse. But that voice, that raw terror in it, made the decision for him. Jake threw the bolt and yanked the door open. The storm tried to come inside with them. 3 figures stood on his porch, backlit by swirling snow that looked like static on a dead television. A woman, tall and dark-haired, her expensive-looking coat torn at the shoulder and dusted white with ice. And 2 girls, one maybe 10, the other younger, 7 or 8, both shaking so violently that Jake could see it even through their bulky jackets. "Thank God," the woman breathed, and her voice cracked on the words like breaking ice. "Thank God. Please, we crashed, and I didn't know if there was anyone, get inside." Jake's voice came out rough, unused to speech after days of silence. He grabbed the older girl's arm and pulled her across the threshold, then reached for the younger one. "Now, move." They stumbled in, bringing cold air and desperation with them. Jake slammed the door against the wind and shot the bolt home, his mind already running scenarios: hypothermia, frostbite, shock. The cabin was barely above freezing itself. He'd let the fire die down to nothing over the past hours, not seeing the point in staying warm for a plan that would end in cooling anyway. In the lamplight, he got his first real look at them. The woman was maybe 35, with sharp, intelligent features beneath the fear and exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had half escaped, and there was a cut above her left eyebrow, crusted with dried blood. Designer jeans, thermal boots that probably cost more than his truck had been worth. Money. This was money standing in his cabin, looking utterly out of place against the rough-hewn logs and second-hand furniture. The girls, clearly her daughters, both with the same dark hair and fine features, were in better shape than he'd expected. Cold, scared, but moving, responsive. The older one clutched a backpack to her chest like a shield. The younger one had tears frozen on her cheeks. "How long were you out there?" Jake demanded, already moving toward the fireplace. He grabbed kindling from the box beside the hearth, his hands moving with muscle memory from years of mountain winters. 20 minutes, maybe 30. The woman wrapped her arms around her daughters, pulling them close. "We went off the road about 2 miles down. I tried to keep the car running, but the engine died, and I thought..." Her voice broke. "I saw your light through the trees. I didn't know if you were real or if I was hallucinating, but I had to try. I had to..." "Save it." Jake struck a match, coaxing flame from the kindling. "We'll talk when you're warm. Right now, I need you to get those wet coats off. Hypothermia kills faster than you think." He fed the growing fire carefully, adding larger pieces of wood once the kindling caught properly. The flames grew, casting dancing shadows up the walls, bringing the cabin back to life in shades of orange and gold. The irony wasn't lost on him. 15 minutes ago, he'd been ready to let everything go dark forever. Now he was fighting to keep 3 strangers alive. The woman helped her daughters out of their coats, revealing layers of thermal clothing underneath. Smart. Someone had prepared them for winter travel, even if not for this. The older girl, still clutching that backpack, had stopped shaking quite so violently, but her eyes were huge and dark in the firelight, taking in the sparse cabin with the kind of awareness that worried Jake. She'd seen too much tonight. They all had. There are blankets in that chest. He pointed without looking, focused on building the fire into something that would actually heat the space. Wool ones. Get them wrapped up and close to the fire, but not too close. You don't want burns on top of everything else. Thank you. The woman's voice was steadier now, though still edged with tears. Thank you so much. I didn't think... When the car went off the road, I thought we were going to die out there. Jake didn't answer. He added another log to the fire, watching sparks spiral up the chimney, and tried not to think about how close she'd actually come to being right. If she'd arrived 5 minutes later, 1 minute later, there would have been no answer at that door. Just a body cooling in a chair and 3 people freezing to death on a porch in a Christmas Eve blizzard. The universe had a sixth sense of timing. He stood, finally, and turned to face them. The girls were wrapped in the wool blankets he'd indicated, huddled together near the fire like refugees from some disaster movie. Which, he supposed, they were. The woman stood between them and the rest of the cabin, her posture protective even in exhaustion, and Jake recognized that stance. Mother Bear. She'd die before she let anything else happen to those kids. I'm Laura. She offered the words like a handshake, formal despite the circumstances. Laura Bennett. These are my daughters. Sophie is 10, and Maya is 7. The older girl, Sophie, clutched her backpack tighter. The younger one, Maya, just stared at him with those huge dark eyes, and Jake felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. She looked about Cody's age. Same dark hair, same way of looking at the world like she was trying to figure out if it was safe yet. Jake Mason. He should probably say more, but the words felt stuck somewhere behind his ribs. Laura's gaze swept the cabin, taking in details he suddenly saw through her eyes. The bare walls, the single chair at the table, the empty bottles lined up near the sink like soldiers, the oil lamp instead of electric lights. And there, on the table where he'd been sitting, her eyes locked on the gun. Jake watched her face change, understanding flowing across it like cold water. The Colt 45 gleaming in the lamplight, the folded letter with "For Cody" written across it. The complete absence of anything that suggested someone was actually living here rather than just waiting to die here. Oh, she said softly. So softly that the girls didn't hear it over the crackling fire. Oh, God. Their eyes met, and Jake saw his own death reflected in her comprehension. She knew. She knew exactly what she'd interrupted, what her desperate knock had pulled him back from. And in that moment of terrible clarity, he couldn't tell which of them had actually been saved tonight. Don't. His voice came out harder than he meant it to. Don't say anything. Laura swallowed, nodded once, and turned back to her daughters, but her hands were shaking now, and it wasn't from the cold. Jake grabbed the Colt from the table, ejected the magazine, and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. The live round clinked onto the wooden surface, absurdly loud in the quiet that had fallen over the cabin. He shoved both gun and magazine into the drawer of the side table, out of sight, then folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Evidence removed. Crisis averted. Pretend everything was fine, except nothing was fine. And they all knew it. There's coffee. He moved toward the small kitchen area, needing something to do with his hands. Or I can heat up some water for tea. There might be hot chocolate somewhere if the... Jake. Laura's voice stopped him mid-step. What were you about to do? He stood with his back to her, staring at the dark window above the sink, seeing nothing but his own reflection ghosted in the glass. A gaunt face, unshaven, with eyes that looked like they belonged to someone much older. When had he started looking like this? When had he become this person? Something stupid, he said finally. You stopped me. So thank you for that, I guess. You guess? There was something fierce in her tone now, cutting through the exhaustion. You guess? Do you have any idea? My God, if we'd been 5 minutes later. But you weren't. He turned to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her stop. You're here. You're alive. Your girls are alive. So let's focus on keeping it that way, yeah? This storm's not letting up anytime soon, and we've got a long night ahead. Sophie spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear. Is your name really on the letter? Jake's chest tightened. What? The letter you put in your pocket. It says for Cody. Is that your name or someone else's? Smart kid, observant, the kind of intelligence that would serve her well in life and keep her parents up at night with worry. Jake knew the type. He'd been that type once, before Kandahar taught him that some things were better left unnoticed. Someone else's, he admitted. My son. Where is he? Sophie, Laura's hand touched her daughter's shoulder, a gentle warning. That's not... He lives with his mom, Jake interrupted. She's better at this than I am. The whole parenting thing. The whole life thing, honestly. Sophie studied him with those two old eyes. Were you going to kill yourself? Sophie! Laura's face went white. Oh my God, you can't just... It's okay. Jake held up a hand, surprised to find that it was. Maybe the bluntness was better than dancing around it. Kids always knew anyway. They saw more than adults gave them credit for. Yeah, I was, but I didn't, thanks to you guys. Maya started crying then, silent tears rolling down her face. And Jake felt like the worst kind of bastard for making a 7-year-old confront adult darkness on Christmas Eve. But what was he supposed to do? Lie? Pretend? The evidence was right there. The gun, the letter, the complete and utter absence of anything that suggested tomorrow was worth seeing. Hey, no. He crouched down, getting to her eye level, the way he used to with Cody. No crying, okay? I'm fine now. You saved me. All 3 of you saved me by knocking on that door. You're like superheroes. We don't feel like superheroes, Sophie muttered. We feel like we're running for our lives. The words dropped into the cabin like a stone into still water, and Jake felt the temperature shift. Not the physical temperature. The fire was doing its job, warming the space back to something approaching comfortable. But something else. Something dangerous. He stood slowly, his attention sharpening, years of combat experience suddenly screaming at him that he'd missed something crucial. What do you mean, running? Laura's face closed down, walls slamming into place behind her eyes. Nothing. She didn't mean, Mom. Sophie's voice was steady, adult in a way that broke something inside Jake's chest. He just told us he was going to kill himself. I think we can tell him why we're really here. Sophie, it's not safe. We went off the road because someone was chasing us, Sophie said, ignoring her mother's protest. Black SUVs, 2 of them. They forced us off at that hairpin turn near Dead Man's Drop. Mom kept driving even after the airbags went off, but the car died and we had to run. We've been running for 3 hours. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, and Jake felt the old instincts kicking in, the ones that had kept him alive in Helmand Province and kept his squad breathing through 18 months of asymmetric warfare, the ones he'd thought were dead, buried under whiskey and pills and despair. Black SUVs, he repeated slowly. Professional? Laura closed her eyes. Very. How many men? I don't know. I didn't stop to count. 4 in the first vehicle, at least. I didn't see the second one clearly. Jake's mind was already moving, running threat assessments, calculating response options. The cabin was defensible, single story, stone foundation, limited approaches. But it was also isolated, cut off by the storm, with no backup and no support. Against professional operators, that made it either a fortress or a tomb, depending on how things played out. Why? He demanded. Why were they chasing you? Who are you people? Laura opened her eyes, and Jake saw something in them he recognized. The look of someone who'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, made a choice that couldn't be unmade. He'd worn that look himself in the mirror for years. I'm the CEO of Bennett Technologies, she said quietly. And 3 days ago, I discovered that someone inside my company has been stealing military-grade cybersecurity technology and selling it to foreign actors. When I confronted him, when I told him I was going to the FBI, she swallowed hard. He said I'd made a mistake, that I didn't understand how things worked, that some people were too important to cross. Victor Hale, Sophie added, her voice dripping with venom, inappropriate for a 10-year-old. He's the COO, and he's a monster. Jake felt something cold settle into his stomach. Military-grade technology, foreign actors, professional pursuit teams in the Colorado mountains on Christmas Eve. This wasn't corporate espionage anymore. This was treason, probably, and the kind of money and power that could make entire families disappear. "And he sent those men after you," Jake said. Not a question. "They came to my house this morning." Laura's voice was barely above a whisper. 4 of them, dressed like private security. They said Mr. Hale wanted to discuss the matter before I did anything rash. But the way they stood, the way they looked at my daughters. She pulled the girls closer. I grabbed the emergency bag I keep in the hall closet, put the girls in the car, and drove. I thought, God, I don't know what I thought. That I could get to Denver, maybe, find a federal building, walk into the FBI office, tell them everything. But they followed you, Jake finished, all the way up the mountain. I thought I could lose them in the storm, that maybe the weather would force them to turn back. But they just kept coming, and at that hairpin turn, her voice cracked. They rammed us, deliberately. We went through the guardrail, and for a second I thought we were going over the edge. But the car caught on something, rolled, ended up in the trees. Airbags deployed, but the engine was wrecked, so we ran. Jake processed this, his mind working through implications and possibilities. If these were professionals, and everything Laura was describing suggested they were, then they wouldn't stop because of a little snow. They'd have equipment, training, resources. They'd also have orders, and those orders probably included no witnesses, which meant Laura and her daughters were dead the moment those men found them, which meant Jake had about 30 seconds to decide if he was going to die tonight after all, just differently than he'd planned. He looked at the girls. Sophie, fierce and frightened and trying so hard to be brave. Maya still crying silently, wrapped in her blanket like armor against the world. And Laura, standing between them and the door, ready to fight with her bare hands if that's what it took. He thought about Cody, who'd be opening presents tomorrow morning, or today morning technically, since midnight had probably come and gone, without his father. Who'd grow up with the story of the dad who gave up, who couldn't hack it, who chose a bullet over breakfast. And he thought about the letter in his pocket, with all its careful apologies and empty promises about being brave. Be brave, be kind, be the man I couldn't figure out how to be. How long since they lost track of you? Jake asked. Laura blinked, thrown by the shift in his tone. What? The men chasing you. How long since they knew where you were? Maybe 2 hours? We kept to the trees, avoided the roads. I was trying to put distance between. But they know you're in this area, and there are only so many structures on this mountain. They'll search them all, systematically, until they find you. Jake moved to the window, peering out at the storm. Visibility was maybe 20 feet in the swirling snow. That storm's your friend right now. It's slowing them down, making thermal imaging useless, forcing them to move carefully. But it won't stop them. So what do we do? Laura's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. He turned back to face them, and something must have shifted in his expression because Sophie's eyes went wide. You said you crashed your car, Jake said. Did it burn? Anything to make them think you died in the wreck? No, we just ran. Then they know you're alive. They know you're on foot, and they know you need shelter. He moved to the side table, pulled open the drawer, and took out the Colt. Laura flinched, but Jake just reinserted the magazine and chambered around with a smooth motion. Which means they're coming here. Maybe not tonight. Maybe the storm buys us until morning, but they're coming. You want to fight them? Laura stared at him like he'd lost his mind. There are at least 4 of them, probably more. We should run. We should... Run where? Jake's voice was flat, factual. You've got 2 kids who are already half frozen, 0 supplies, and a blizzard that'll kill you in an hour without proper gear. Those men out there are trained, equipped, and motivated. You'd be dead before you made it a mile. So we just wait here to die? No. Jake checked the Colt's action, then looked up at her with something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cold. We wait here to fight. This cabin's defensible. I know the terrain. I've got weapons, ammunition, and about 20 years of experience keeping people alive in worse situations than this. You're one man, Laura protested. I'm a Marine, Jake corrected quietly. And Marines don't leave people behind. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Jake was only beginning to understand himself. 20 minutes ago, he'd been ready to abandon everything, his son, his life, whatever remained of his honor and purpose. But these three strangers had knocked on his door and changed the equation. They needed him, actually needed him, in a way nothing and no one had needed him in years. And maybe, that meant something. Sophie spoke up, her voice small but determined. "You'll really fight for us? Even though you don't know us?" Jake looked at her fierce young face so full of fear and hope, and thought about Cody, about what he'd want someone to do if Cody was the one running through a snowstorm with killers on his heels. "Yeah," he said simply. "I'll fight." "Then what do we do?" Laura asked. Jake's mind shifted into operational mode, the same cold clarity that had kept him alive in Kandahar flowing back like it had never left. "First, we fortify. Windows, doors, sight lines. Then we prepare fallback positions and escape routes in case they breach. Then we wait, and we watch. And if they come—" He met Laura's eyes. "If they come, I do what I'm good at." "Which is?" "Keeping people alive," Jake said. "No matter the cost." He moved to the closet beside the front door, pulled out his old tactical vest, dusty but serviceable, and started checking pouches and pockets. 2 more magazines for the Colt, a hunting knife his grandfather had carried, a flashlight that still worked. Not much, but more than nothing. "Sophie, Maya," he kept his voice calm, authoritative. "I need you two to go into that bedroom." He pointed to the single door off the main room. "And stay there unless your mom or I tell you otherwise. There's a window in there. If things go bad, you climb out and run due east. You'll hit the highway eventually. Flag down any car you see." "What about Mom?" Maya's voice was tiny, terrified. "Your mom stays with me," Jake said. "She's an extra set of eyes, and I need that. But you two, your job is to stay safe and stay quiet. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded slowly, then took her little sister's hand. "Come on, Maya. We'll be okay. He's going to protect us." Jake wished he felt as certain as she sounded. The girls disappeared into the bedroom, and Jake heard the door click shut. Then it was just him and Laura, standing in the firelit cabin while the storm howled outside and unknown threats moved through the darkness. "I should tell you," Laura said quietly, "that I don't know how to shoot. I've never held a gun in my life." "That's fine. I don't need you to shoot. I need you to watch that window." He pointed to the one facing south. "And tell me the second you see anything that doesn't belong. Lights, movement, shadows, anything." "I can do that." She paused, then added, "Why are you doing this? You don't know us." An hour ago I was a coward," Jake interrupted. "Now I'm trying very hard not to be. So let me do this, okay? Let me be useful for once." Laura stared at him for a long moment, and Jake couldn't read what was in her eyes. Gratitude, pity, fear? Probably all of it mixed together into something he didn't have a name for. "Thank you," she finally said, "for opening the door." "Thank you," Jake replied, "for knocking." He turned away before she could see his face, before she could see that his hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the weight of purpose settling back onto shoulders that had forgotten how to carry it. For months he'd felt like he was drowning, like every breath was borrowed time he didn't deserve. But now, with 3 lives depending on him, with a mission clear and simple and worth dying for, now he could breathe. Jake moved through the cabin with renewed focus, his eyes cataloging defensive positions and vulnerability points. The front door was solid oak with a deadbolt. Good, but not good enough against professionals with breaching equipment. He dragged his grandfather's heavy bookshelf in front of it, then added the kitchen table for good measure. Not impassable, but it would slow them down, make noise, give him warning and time to respond. The windows were the real problem. Old single-pane glass, large enough for a man to climb through. Jake checked the storm shutters. His grandfather had installed them back in the 70s and found them still functional. He secured them over the front windows, then moved to the others, working methodically while Laura watched from her position near the south-facing window. "Tell me about this Victor Hale," Jake said as he worked. "What kind of resources does he have access to?" Laura's reflection in the glass showed tension in every line of her body. "Virtually unlimited. Bennett Technologies has government contracts worth billions. Victor oversees most of them. He could hire private military contractors, bribe officials, make entire investigations disappear." But he can't make you disappear without raising questions, Jake pointed out. You're the CEO. People would notice. Not if I died in a tragic accident during a Christmas Eve road trip with my daughters. Laura's voice was bitter. Icy mountain roads, terrible storm, grieving COO steps up to ensure the company's legacy continues. Very neat, very convenient. Jake secured the last shutter and turned to face her. Except you didn't die. You made it here. And that changes things. Does it? We're still trapped in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, with men hunting us and no way to call for help. Actually, Jake moved to the closet again, pushing aside winter coats and emergency supplies until he found what he was looking for. His grandfather's old CB radio, dusty but potentially functional. My grandfather was a ham radio enthusiast. This thing might still work. He carried it to the table, plugged it in, and flipped the power switch. Static crackled from the speaker. Faint, but there. Jake adjusted the frequency, trying to remember the emergency channels from his days in the Corps. Breaker, breaker. This is Jake Mason broadcasting from the old Mason cabin on Timber Ridge Road, he said into the microphone. We have an emergency situation. 3 civilians in danger, potential hostile forces in the area. Requesting immediate law enforcement and emergency services response. Over. Nothing but static answered him. Jake tried again, adjusting the frequency, boosting the gain. This is Jake Mason broadcasting on emergency frequency. We need help at the Mason cabin, Timber Ridge Road, approximately 8 miles south of Winter Park. Civilians in danger, please respond. Over. More static. Then, faintly, a voice emerged from the crackling. Copy that. Can barely... Can you... Yes. Jake leaned closer to the radio. This is Jake Mason. We need immediate assistance. Armed hostiles pursuing 3 civilians. Request law enforcement response. Over. The voice faded in and out. Jake Mason. Roads closed. Earliest response. When? Jake demanded. How long until you can get here? Storm? Maybe morning? Hold tight. The signal dissolved back into static, and no amount of adjusting could bring it back. Jake slammed his palm against the table in frustration. Morning? Laura repeated hollowly. They might get here by morning. Might, Jake confirmed, which means we're on our own until then. He checked his watch, 2:47 a.m. At least 3 hours until dawn, longer until anyone could reasonably attempt the access road. 3 hours minimum that they had to hold out. 3 hours against an unknown number of professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to murder 2 children if it meant keeping their secrets safe. Jake returned to the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters. The snow was still falling hard, visibility almost zero. He couldn't see the tree line, couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. They could be out there right now, circling, preparing, and he wouldn't know until... A flicker of light in the distance. Just a flash, there and gone, maybe 100 yards out. Laura, Jake said quietly, get the girls, now. Move them to the bedroom and tell them to stay absolutely silent. What did you see? Flashlight. Maybe a headlamp. Someone's out there. He pulled the Colt from his waistband and moved to the other window, checking angles. They're doing reconnaissance, mapping the cabin's layout before they move in. Laura disappeared into the bedroom. Jake heard urgent whispers, stifled crying quickly hushed. Then she was back, her face pale but determined. What do I do? Jake pointed to the far corner of the cabin, behind the heavy stone fireplace. You get behind that. It's the best cover we've got. If shooting starts, you stay down and you don't move until I tell you it's clear. Understand? And you? I'll be right here, Jake said, doing my job. Another light flickered in the darkness, this time from a different direction. Then another. They were being surrounded, methodically, professionally. Jake counted positions, at least 3, maybe 4. Could be more hanging back as backup or reserves. His grandfather's hunting rifle was in the closet, he remembered. An old Remington 700 with a scope. Good range, reliable. Jake retrieved it quickly, checked that it was still loaded, and set it near the window where he could access it if needed. Between the Colt for close quarters and the rifle for distance, he at least had options. Jake, Laura's voice was steady despite her obvious fear. If this goes bad, If they get through, they won't. But if they do, promise me you'll save the girls, not me, them. Jake looked at her, this woman he'd met less than an hour ago, and saw the same thing he'd seen in mirrors for 5 years, someone ready to die if it meant protecting what they loved. I promise, he said, that I'm going to save all 3 of you, or I'm going to die trying. Those are the only 2 options. A sound outside, soft, almost inaudible under the wind, but Jake's trained ears caught it. Footsteps crunching in snow, trying to be quiet and failing. Someone was approaching the cabin from the north side. Jake moved to that window, staying low, weapon ready. Through the gap in the shutters, he could just make out a figure in the darkness, bulky with cold weather gear and tactical equipment. The figure moved carefully, deliberately, a rifle held at the ready. Professional. Military or ex-military. Someone who knew what they were doing. Jake's finger tightened on the Colt's trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Once the shooting started, there was no taking it back, no de-escalation possible. And despite everything, despite the threats and the danger and the clear intent of these people, some part of him still hoped this could end without more death on his conscience. The figure reached the side of the cabin and paused, pressing against the wall. Jake tracked him through the window, waiting, his breath steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. Then a voice, amplified by a megaphone, shattered the mountain silence. Laura Bennett, we know you're in there. Send out the girls and we can talk about this like adults. Jake glanced back at Laura, saw her face go white. They don't want to talk, she whispered. They want to make sure there are no witnesses. I know, Jake said. The megaphone voice continued. You've got 60 seconds to send out the children. After that, we come in. And trust me, Mrs. Bennett, you don't want us to come in. Jake made his decision. He moved to the door, shouted through the barricaded wood, This is Jake Mason, property owner. The people you're looking for have requested sanctuary. I'm a United States Marine and I'm armed. You've got 30 seconds to clear off my land before I start shooting. Silence. Then laughter, cold and sharp. A Marine? Outstanding. That makes this interesting. But here's the thing, Marine. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. We don't want to hurt you. This isn't your fight. Just walk away. Can't do that, Jake called back. These people are under my protection. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around, get in your vehicles, and drive away. And in the morning, when the road's clear, we're all going to pretend this never happened. More laughter. You think you can take us all? There's 5 of us out here, Marine. All armed, all trained. You're one man in a wooden cabin. This isn't Fallujah. You can't win this. Maybe not, Jake admitted. But I can make it expensive. So ask yourself, is killing 1 woman and 2 kids worth dying for? Because I guarantee at least 2 of you aren't going home. The silence that followed was longer this time, and Jake could almost hear the tactical assessment happening outside. They'd expected an easy target, a desperate woman with no resources and no backup. Instead, they'd found a prepared defensive position with an experienced combatant. The cost-benefit calculation just changed dramatically. Finally, you've got 1 minute to reconsider, Marine. After that, we come in hard. Jake moved back to the window, scanning for positions. He could see them now, 5 figures in tactical gear, spread out around the cabin in a loose perimeter. Professional positioning, good overlapping fields of fire. They knew what they were doing, but so did he. Laura, Jake said quietly, whatever happens, you stay behind that fireplace. You understand? No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you do not leave that cover. Jake, promise me. I promise. Jake checked the Colt one last time, then picked up the rifle. 5 targets. 8 rounds in the Colt, 4 in the rifle. Not enough to win, but maybe enough to survive until dawn. Maybe enough to matter. The megaphone voice started a countdown. 60, 59, 58. Jake settled into position behind the window, his breathing steady, his hands rock solid on the rifle. He thought about Cody, about Emma, about the letter still folded in his pocket. He thought about the gun he'd pressed against his temple an hour ago, ready to end everything. And he thought about 3 strangers who'd knocked on his door and given him one last chance to be the man he'd always wanted to be. 30, 29, 28. In the bedroom, one of the girls was crying softly. Jake heard Laura's whispered reassurances, promises that everything would be okay, lies told with love and desperation. 10, 9, 8. Jake sighted down the rifle at the nearest figure, a man crouched behind a tree about 40 yards out. Center mass, easy shot, even in the dark and snow. He'd made harder shots in worse conditions. 3, 2, 1. The last word hung in the air like a held breath, and then the shooting started. The first shot came from Jake's rifle, a crack that split the night like thunder, followed immediately by a scream from the darkness. The figure behind the tree went down, and Jake was already moving, dropping the rifle and pulling the Colt as muzzle flashes erupted from 3 directions at once. The cabin exploded into chaos. Bullets punched through the shutters, splintering wood and sending fragments spinning through the air like shrapnel. Jake dove behind the heavy stone fireplace, his body covering Laura's as glass shattered and the air filled with the smell of cordite and fear. "Stay down!" he shouted over the deafening noise. "Don't move!" The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence broken only by the wind and someone outside cursing in pain. Jake risked a glance around the fireplace edge. The shutters were Swiss cheese now, useless for cover, but at least obscuring sightlines. 4 shadows moved in the darkness, regrouping, reassessing. He'd dropped one. 4 left. Not great odds, but better than 5. "Last chance, Marine!" The megaphone voice was angry now, the professional veneer cracking. "Surrender the targets, or we burn you out!" Jake's mind raced. Burn them out? They had incendiaries, probably. Standard tactical option when dealing with fortified positions. They'd throw thermite or white phosphorus through the windows, turn the cabin into an inferno, force everyone out into the open where they could be picked off easily. It was exactly what Jake would do in their position, which meant he needed to change the equation before they had time to implement it. "Laura, listen to me very carefully." Jake's voice was steady, the combat calm that had kept him alive through 18 months of firefights flowing through him like ice water. "I'm going to open that door and go out there. When I do, you take the girls through the bedroom window and run. Due east, remember? Don't stop, don't look back, just run." "You'll die out there," Laura protested, her voice breaking. "Maybe, but you'll live. And that's what matters." He ejected the Colt's magazine, checked his remaining rounds, 6 left. Not enough for 4 targets, but then again, he'd done more with less in Kandahar. "Tell the girls I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. Tell them—" "No." Laura's hand grabbed his arm, surprisingly strong. "No, there has to be another way. We can—" An explosion of breaking glass cut her off as something crashed through the north window, trailing sparks and white smoke. Jake saw it in the half-second before it hit the floor. A thermite grenade, military grade, the kind that burned at 4,000 degrees and couldn't be extinguished with water. "Move!" He shoved Laura toward the bedroom, then lunged for the grenade, scooped it up with his bare hand, the heat already searing his palm, and hurled it back through the shattered window in one desperate motion. It detonated outside in a blast of white fire that turned night into noon, screams following as someone caught the edge of that inferno. Jake's hand was a mass of blistered pain, but he had no time to process it. Another window shattered, the south one this time, and 2 figures in tactical gear came through fast and professional, weapons up and scanning for targets. Jake fired twice. The first man went down with a bullet through the throat, gurgling and thrashing. The second returned fire, and Jake felt something punch his left shoulder, spinning him partially around. He fired again, emptying the magazine into center mass until the second man collapsed backward through the window he'd just entered. 3 down, 2 left, and Jake was out of ammunition for the Colt. He dropped the empty pistol and scrambled for the rifle, his wounded shoulder screaming protest with every movement. Blood ran hot down his arm, soaking through his shirt, but his right hand still worked, and that was all that mattered. He grabbed the Remington, worked the bolt, and brought it up just as the front door, barricade and all, exploded inward in a shower of splinters. The breaching charge had been perfectly placed, blowing the lock and hinges simultaneously. The heavy bookshelf toppled backward, and through the smoke and debris came the last 2 men, moving like ghosts, weapons tracking for targets with mechanical precision. Jake fired from the hip, the rifle's recoil savage against his wounded shoulder. One man twisted sideways as the bullet caught him in the ribs, not fatal, but enough to put him down temporarily. The other returned fire, and Jake felt the world tilt as something hit him high in the chest, just below the collarbone. He went down hard, the rifle clattering away across the floor. The pain was distant, abstract, his body pumping so much adrenaline that shock insulated him from the worst of it. He could see the ceiling, could see smoke swirling in the firelight, could hear Laura screaming his name from somewhere that seemed very far away. The remaining operative moved into his field of vision, a young guy, maybe 30, with cold professional eyes above a tactical mask. He pointed his rifle down at Jake's face, and Jake could see his finger tightening on the trigger. This was it. The end. After everything, he was going to die on his grandfather's cabin floor, and Laura and the girls would follow him into darkness within minutes. He'd failed. Again. Just like he'd failed his squad, failed his marriage, failed his son. The operative's head exploded. The shot came from the bedroom doorway, impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The operative collapsed sideways, and there stood Laura, Jake's hunting rifle clutched in her shaking hands, her face spattered with blood that wasn't hers, her eyes wide with shock and horror and fierce maternal rage. "I said I couldn't shoot," she gasped. "I lied." The other operative, the one Jake had hit in the ribs, was struggling to his feet, reaching for his sidearm with his good hand. Jake tried to move, tried to warn Laura, but his body wouldn't respond properly. Everything felt heavy, sluggish, like moving through deep water. Laura saw the threat and fired again, but the shot went wild, punching through the wall behind the man. She worked the bolt frantically, but the rifle was empty. Jake had only loaded 4 rounds, and she'd just used the last one. The operative brought his pistol up, aiming at Laura, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Jake could see it happening frame by frame. The man's finger on the trigger, Laura dropping the useless rifle and stepping in front of the bedroom door, in front of her daughters, arms spread wide like she could shield them with her body alone. And somewhere deep inside, past the pain and the blood loss and the creeping darkness at the edge of his vision, Jake found one last reserve of strength. He surged up from the floor, ignoring his body's screams of protest, and threw himself at the operative's legs in a tackle that would have made his high school football coach proud. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and equipment. The operative's pistol fired, the bullet going wild into the ceiling. Jake got his right hand around the man's wrist, slamming it against the floor until the gun skittered away. Then they were fighting hand to hand, brutal and desperate, with Jake using every dirty trick he'd learned in 2 decades of combat. He headbutted the operative's nose, felt cartilage crunch. Drove his knee into the man's wounded ribs, making him scream. Got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed, kept squeezing even as the operative clawed at his face and thrashed beneath him. The struggling weakened, then stopped. Jake held on for another 10 seconds, making sure, then rolled off the body and lay gasping on his back. The ceiling spun above him, and he was so cold, colder than the storm outside, cold all the way down to his bones. "Jake," Laura was beside him, her hands on his chest, trying to stem the bleeding. "Oh God, Jake, stay with me. Stay awake." "Girls," he managed through lips that felt numb. "Safe?" "Yes, they're safe. You saved us. You saved all of us." "Good." The darkness was creeping in from all sides now, and Jake was too tired to fight it anymore. "Tell Cody. Tell him." "You'll tell him yourself," Laura said fiercely. "You're not dying in this cabin. I won't let you. Do you hear me? I won't let you die." Jake wanted to tell her that some things were beyond her control, that sometimes people died, no matter how much others wanted them to live. But the words wouldn't come, and the darkness was so inviting, and he was just so tired of fighting. His eyes closed. "Jake," Laura's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Jake, don't you dare!" But the darkness had him now, pulling him down into depths where there was no pain, no failure, no grief, just peaceful, empty silence. The sound of sirens pulled him back, or maybe it was the pain that pulled him back, screaming through his shoulder and chest with renewed intensity as consciousness returned. Jake opened his eyes to find himself still on the cabin floor, but now there were other people there. Emergency responders in bright yellow jackets, someone pressing gauze to his wounds, voices shouting medical jargon he only half understood. Lost a lot of blood. Stable for now, but we need GS bios, one through and through shoulder, one lodged near the clavicle. Hell of a fight, 5 hostiles down. Jake tried to sit up, but hands pushed him back down gently but firmly. Easy there, Marine, a paramedic said, young guy with kind eyes. You've got 2 bullet wounds and some serious burns on your hand. You need to stay still. Laura, Jake croaked. The girls, are they? They're fine. Shaken up but unhurt. The mom's with them now, giving statements to the FBI. The paramedic was starting an IV, and Jake felt the cool rush of fluids entering his system. You did good. Real good. Those people would have died if you hadn't been here. Jake closed his eyes, letting relief wash over him. They were safe. Whatever else happened, he'd accomplished that much. He'd kept them alive. Can you tell me your name? The paramedic asked. For our records? Jake Mason, former sergeant, USMC. Well, Sergeant Mason, you're one tough son of a bitch. That shot near your collarbone came about an inch from your subclavian artery. If it had hit that, you'd have bled out in minutes. An inch. The difference between life and death measured in fractions. Story of his life, really. They loaded him onto a stretcher, and as they carried him toward the door, Jake saw the carnage he'd wrought. 5 bodies scattered around his grandfather's cabin, like broken dolls. Blood everywhere, on the walls, the floor, soaking into the old rugs his grandmother had woven. The front door was splinters. 3 windows were shattered. The place looked like a war zone, because it had been a war zone. And for once in his life, Jake had been on the winning side. Outside, the storm had finally broken. Dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and the fresh snow made everything look clean and new, like the violence of the night had never happened. Emergency vehicles crowded the small clearing. Ambulances, sheriff's cruisers, black SUVs that probably belonged to the FBI. And there, standing beside one of the ambulances wrapped in thermal blankets, were Laura and her daughters. When Laura saw Jake being carried out, she broke away from the agents interviewing her and ran to his stretcher. You're alive, she breathed, and there were tears streaming down her face. They said you were alive, but I had to see... Hard to kill, Jake managed a weak smile. Marines are cockroaches. We survive everything. You saved us. Laura's hand found his good one, squeezed tight. Those men would have killed us, but you fought them all. You nearly died for us. Nearly doesn't count, Jake said. Besides, you saved me too. That shot through the bedroom door, that was world class. I've never shot anyone before. Laura's voice was hollow. I've never even held a gun before tonight. But when I saw him about to kill you, when I thought about what would happen to my daughters if you died, you did what you had to do, Jake interrupted gently, and you did it perfectly. That's all that matters. Sophie and Maya had approached during this exchange, staying close to their mother, but watching Jake with enormous eyes. He tried to smile at them, but wasn't sure his face was cooperating properly. Thank you, Sophie said, her voice small but steady. For keeping your promise. For protecting us. Yeah, Maya added, her voice barely a whisper. You're a hero. Jake wanted to tell them he wasn't a hero, that heroes didn't spend their nights staring at loaded guns and writing goodbye letters. But before he could form the words, the paramedics were loading him into the ambulance, and Laura was being pulled away by agents who had more questions, and the cabin was receding into the distance as they started down the mountain toward the hospital in Winter Park. The paramedic, his name tag said Thompson, was checking Jake's vitals and adjusting the IV drip. You're stable enough for transport, he said, but you're going to need surgery to remove that bullet near your collarbone, and that hand, that's a pretty serious burn. Thermite? Yeah. Had to throw it back before it turned the cabin into a furnace. Thompson whistled low. That's hardcore. Most people would have frozen up. Most people weren't Marines, Jake said, then paused. Actually, that's not true. Most people would have done the same thing if their friends were in danger. Being a Marine just means I practiced it more. The ambulance hit a bump and pain flared through Jake's shoulder hard enough to make his vision gray out for a moment. When it cleared, Thompson was adjusting something on the IV. Gave you a little something for the pain, the paramedic explained. Should make the ride easier. Jake felt the medication working, dulling the sharp edges of agony into something more manageable. His thoughts started to drift, floating on the pharmaceutical tide, and he found himself thinking about the letter still folded in his pocket, soaked now with blood and sweat. "Hey," he said to Thompson, "can you do me a favor?" "Depends on the favor." "There's a letter in my right pocket. Can you give it to the FBI agents? Tell them to burn it, or shred it. I don't care, just make sure it doesn't exist anymore." Thompson reached into Jake's pocket carefully, extracted the folded paper, and examined it. "For Cody," he read. "That your son?" "Yeah." "What's the letter say?" Jake closed his eyes. "Things that aren't true anymore. Things I was wrong about. Just, please make sure it goes away." "I can do that," Thompson said quietly. "But maybe instead of destroying it, you should write a new one. Tell your son the truth about tonight. Tell him his dad's a genuine hero." "I'm not... Brother, you killed 5 men who were trying to murder a woman and 2 kids. You took 2 bullets doing it. If that's not heroic, I don't know what is." Jake wanted to argue, but the medication was pulling him down into a warm, fuzzy place where arguments seemed less important than rest. His last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was that maybe, just maybe, Thompson had a point. Maybe the story didn't have to end with a bullet and a letter. Maybe there could be other endings, better ones, the kind where broken people got second chances and children didn't grow up without fathers. Maybe hope wasn't just for other people after all. When Jake woke again, he was in a hospital bed surrounded by beeping machines and the antiseptic smell of sterilized everything. His left shoulder was wrapped in enough bandages to mummify a small person. His right hand was covered in specialized burn dressings, and there was an IV in his arm pumping clear fluids into his system. A nurse noticed him stirring and appeared at his bedside almost immediately, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficiency written into every movement. "Welcome back, Mr. Mason," she said, checking his vitals on the monitor above his head. "You've been out for about 6 hours. The surgery went well. They removed the bullet and repaired the damage. You're going to be sore for a while, but you'll make a full recovery." "What time is it?" Jake's voice came out as a croak. "Just after 2 in the afternoon. Christmas Day, if you're keeping track." Christmas. Jake had forgotten entirely. Somewhere out there, Cody was probably playing with new toys, eating too much candy, being a normal 10-year-old kid having a normal Christmas. The thought made something warm unfurl in Jake's chest. "There are some people waiting to see you," the nurse continued. "FBI agents, mostly. They've been very patient, but they need to take your statement about what happened last night. Are you up for visitors?" "Yeah," Jake said. "Send them in." The agents came in pairs, a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Chen and a younger man named Agent Martinez. They were professional but not unkind, and they asked their questions with the sort of precision that suggested they already knew most of the answers and just wanted confirmation. Jake walked them through the night chronologically. The knock on the door, Laura's story about the stolen technology, and the pursuit, the arrival of the armed men, the firefight. He left out the part about the gun and the letter. That was his business, not theirs. But everything else he laid out in clear, factual terms. "The woman who came through your window with the rifle," Agent Chen said, consulting her notes. "Mrs. Bennett says you saved her life multiple times, that without your intervention, she and her daughters would certainly have been killed." "She saved mine too," Jake pointed out. "That last operative had me dead to rights. Laura's the one who dropped him." "Yes, she mentioned that. Quite remarkable for someone who claims to have never fired a weapon before." Chen looked up from her notes. "Mr. Mason, do you have any idea who those men were? Any connection to military units, private contractors, anything like that?" "Professional operators," Jake said. "Probably former special forces, hired by someone with deep pockets. They moved like they'd done this kind of work before. But I didn't recognize any of them personally, if that's what you're asking." Martinez spoke up for the first time. "We've identified them through fingerprints and facial recognition. All 5 were former military, 3 Army Rangers, 1 Navy SEAL, 1 Marine Force Recon. They'd been working for a private security firm called Sentinel Solutions for the past 2 years. "Let me guess," Jake said. "Sentinel Solutions has ties to Victor Hale." "Extensive ties," Chen confirmed. Hale has been using them for corporate security for years. We're currently tearing apart both organizations looking for evidence of the technology theft Mrs. Bennett reported. And Mr. Hale himself is in custody, though his lawyers are already trying to claim he knew nothing about what happened on that mountain. But you don't believe that. Not for a second. But belief and proof are different things, especially when you're dealing with someone as wealthy and connected as Victor Hale. Chen closed her notebook. That's where you come in, Mr. Mason. Your actions last night kept our key witnesses alive. Mrs. Bennett has documentation of the technology theft, evidence she'd been compiling for weeks before Hale figured out what she was doing. With her testimony and that evidence, we can build a case that'll put Hale away for decades. She's testifying? Jake asked, surprised. That's dangerous. Hale still has resources, connections. If he wanted to, which is why Mrs. Bennett and her daughters are entering witness protection as soon as we've secured the evidence and taken preliminary testimony, Martinez interrupted. They'll have new identities, new lives, somewhere far away from here. It's the only way to ensure their safety. Something cold settled into Jake's stomach. Witness protection meant disappearance. It meant Laura and the girls would vanish into the bureaucratic machinery of the federal government, emerging somewhere else as someone else, with new names and new histories that had no room for a broken ex-Marine who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. When? He asked quietly. Within the week, Chen said. We're moving fast because we don't know how many other people Hale has on his payroll. The longer Mrs. Bennett stays visible, the greater the risk. Jake nodded, processing this. It made sense. It was the smart play, the safe play. But it also meant he'd never see them again, never know if they were okay, never get to check that his sacrifice had actually meant something in the long run. Does Mrs. Bennett know about this? He asked. She's being briefed right now, Martinez said, and she asked to see you, actually. Once we're finished here, she'd like to visit if you're up for it. Yeah, Jake said. I'd like that. The agents asked a few more questions. Details about the cabin's layout, specifics about who fired first, technicalities about when Jake had felt his life was in danger, before finally declaring themselves satisfied. They promised to keep him updated on the case and left their cards in case he remembered anything else important. After they left, Jake lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in his chest. Relief that Laura and the girls would be safe. Sadness that he'd never see them again. Strange pride that he had done something that mattered, that his last-ditch stand in a mountain cabin might actually result in justice being served. And underneath it all, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The sense that his life had meaning beyond the next bottle or the next nightmare. That maybe he was worth more than a bullet and a goodbye letter. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. Laura entered quietly, looking exhausted but composed. She'd cleaned up since the mountain, no more blood spatter, fresh clothes that someone had probably loaned her, but her eyes still carried the weight of what they'd witnessed. Hey, she said softly. Hey, yourself. Jake tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. The FBI said you wanted to talk? I did. I do. Laura pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. I wanted to say thank you, properly, not in the chaos of ambulances and crime scenes, but here, when I could actually think straight enough to find the right words. You already thanked me. On the mountain. That wasn't enough. That couldn't possibly be enough for what you did. Laura's hands twisted in her lap, and Jake recognized the nervous gesture. He'd seen it before in soldiers trying to process traumatic experiences. You were seconds from killing yourself when we knocked on that door. I saw the gun, the letter. I knew what you were planning, and instead of telling us to go away, instead of finishing what you'd started, you let us in. You protected us. You nearly died for us. Nearly doesn't count, Jake said again, but his heart wasn't in the flippancy this time. It counts to me. Laura met his eyes, and Jake saw something fierce burning in their depths. It counts to Sophie and Maya. You gave us our lives back, Jake, and I will never, ever forget that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Jake said, The agents told me you're going into witness protection. Yes. It's the only way to stay safe while the prosecution builds their case. Victor has too many resources, too many people who owe him favors. If we stay visible, we're targets. I understand. It's smart. But it means I'll never be able to repay you properly, Laura continued, and now there were tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I'll never be able to check on you, to make sure you're okay, to know if... Her voice broke. To know if you found reasons to keep living. Jake felt his own throat tighten. I found one pretty good reason last night. Turns out I'm not as useless as I thought. Turns out maybe I've got something left to give. You have so much to give, Jake, so much, and I wish... Laura stopped, swallowed hard. I wish I could stay and help you see that. Help you build something better than what you had before. But I can't. And that's killing me. You've already helped, Jake said quietly. More than you know. Before you knocked on that door, I was convinced that the world would be better off without me. That my son would be better off without me. But you showed me something different. You showed me that there are still people worth fighting for, causes worth bleeding for. That maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. Laura reached out and took his good hand in both of hers. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll get help. Real help. Therapy, medication, whatever it takes. Promise me you'll fight as hard for yourself as you fought for us. Jake looked at their joined hands, at this woman he'd known for less than 12 hours, but who'd somehow seen straight through to the core of him. I promise, he said, and meant it. I'll fight. And promise me you'll see your son, that you'll use this... She gestured at the hospital room, at his bandaged injuries, at everything that had happened, as proof that you're worth knowing, that you're worth loving. Laura, promise me, Jake. He closed his eyes, thinking about Cody's face, about Emma's disappointed expression the last time they'd spoken, about all the ways he'd failed as a father and a husband. And then he thought about the 5 men lying dead in his grandfather's cabin, about the lives he'd saved, about the fact that he was still breathing despite every reason not to be. I promise, he said. Laura leaned forward and kissed his forehead gently, a gesture that was somehow both maternal and intimate. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Thank you, Jake replied, for knocking. She left shortly after that, wiping tears from her face, and Jake watched her go with a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. He'd never see her again, never know what names she and the girls took, what city they ended up in, whether they were happy in their new lives. But he'd know that somewhere out there 3 people were alive because he'd chosen to open a door instead of pulling a trigger. That had to count for something. That had to matter. The door opened again, and Jake expected another nurse or maybe more agents with follow-up questions. Instead, Emma walked in with Cody at her side. Jake's heart stopped. His son had grown in the 3 months since he'd last seen him, taller, his face losing some of that little boy roundness and taking on hints of the young man he'd become. He wore a new jacket that Jake didn't recognize, new shoes, and he clutched a small wrapped present in his hands like a talisman. Emma looked older too, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. But she was still beautiful, still the woman Jake had fallen in love with a lifetime ago, before war and trauma had turned him into someone she couldn't recognize. Emma, he said hoarsely. Cody, what are you, how did you... The FBI called me this morning, Emma explained, staying close to the door like she might need to bolt. They told me what happened, what you did. She paused, seemed to gather herself. And Cody insisted on coming to see you. It's Christmas, and he wanted to give you your present. Cody stepped forward hesitantly, like approaching a wild animal that might spook. Dad, are you okay? The word, Dad, not Jake, not your father, but Dad, nearly broke him. Jake blinked hard against sudden tears and nodded. Yeah, buddy, I'm okay. Just a little banged up. The FBI lady said you saved 3 people from bad guys. Cody's eyes were enormous. She said you were a hero. I don't know about hero, Jake started, but Emma cut him off. You are, she said firmly. Whatever else has happened, whatever mistakes you've made, what you did last night was heroic. And Cody deserves to know that his father is capable of incredible things. Jake stared at her, searching for sarcasm or anger or any of the things he deserved, but found only sincerity. Emma meant it. She actually meant it. "I got you a present," Cody said, holding out the wrapped package. "Mom said we probably wouldn't see you today, but I made her wrap it anyway just in case. Can I give it to you?" "Of course," Jake managed. Cody approached the bed carefully and set the present on Jake's lap. His hands were shaking slightly, fear probably, or nervousness around the father who'd been absent for so long. But he didn't run away. That was something. That was more than Jake had hoped for. Jake unwrapped the present one-handed, awkward with the bandages and the IV, and found a framed drawing inside. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of what was recognizably his grandfather's cabin. At the top, in Cody's careful printing, "My dad is brave." "I drew it last week," Cody explained, "before I knew about the bad guys and everything. I just wanted you to know that I think you're brave, even when you're sad, even when things are hard." Jake couldn't speak. The tears he'd been fighting finally won, spilling hot down his face, and he clutched the drawing to his chest with his good hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. Because his son, his beautiful, perceptive, incredibly kind son, had seen past the drinking and the anger and the absence to something worth believing in. "Thank you," he whispered. "This is the best present I've ever gotten." Cody smiled, tentative but real, and Jake saw Emma's expression soften behind him. Maybe this could be the beginning of something. Not a return to what they'd had before, because that was gone and good riddance to it, but something new, something better, something built on honesty and effort instead of nostalgia and obligation. "Can I hug you?" Cody asked. "Or will it hurt your ouchies?" Jake laughed, the sound unexpected and slightly hysterical. "Yeah, buddy, you can hug me. Just be gentle, okay?" Cody climbed carefully onto the bed and wrapped his arms around Jake's good side, his small body warm and solid and real. Jake hugged back with his right arm, ignoring the pain from his burns, and breathed in the smell of his son's shampoo and Christmas cookies and hope. "I love you," Jake said into Cody's hair. "I'm sorry I haven't been good at showing it lately, but I love you so much and I'm going to do better, I promise." "I love you too, Dad," Cody mumbled into Jake's shoulder. "And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to try." Out of the mouths of babes, Jake thought. When had his 10-year-old become wiser than him? Emma approached the bed slowly, her eyes glistening. "The FBI also mentioned that you were in a bad place last night," she said quietly, pitched for Jake's ears only. "That if those people hadn't arrived when they did..." Jake met her gaze. "Yeah, I was. I'm sorry you had to find out that way." "Don't be sorry. Be better." Emma's hand touched his uninjured shoulder gently. "Get help, Jake. Real help. Not just for Cody, not just for me, but for yourself. You deserve that. You deserve to be okay." "Laura said the same thing," Jake admitted. "Smart woman. You should listen to her." Emma glanced at Cody, who'd settled against Jake's side like he belonged there. "We should go soon. Visiting hours are almost over and you need rest. But maybe we could come back tomorrow? If you're still here?" "I'd like that," Jake said. "I'd really like that." They stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about small things. Cody's new video game, Emma's job, the Christmas dinner Jake was missing, before finally departing with promises to return. Jake watched them go with that same mixture of grief and gratitude he'd felt when Laura left. But this time there was also possibility. This time there was hope. After they were gone, after the nurse had checked his vitals one more time and dimmed the lights for sleep, Jake lay in the hospital bed holding Cody's drawing and thought about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The gun, the letter, the desperate knock at the door, the firefight, the blood and the fear and the moment when he'd been certain he would die. And then the aftermath. Agents and ambulances, Laura's gratitude, Cody's drawing, Emma's cautious optimism. The sense that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over after all. That maybe the story could have a different ending than the one he'd written. Tomorrow he'd start making calls. He'd find a therapist who specialized in PTSD. He'd look into veteran support groups. He'd talk to his lawyer about the business, see if there was any way to resurrect what he'd lost or build something new from the ashes. He'd call Emma and set up a regular visitation schedule with Cody. He'd do all the things that healthy, functional people did to build lives worth living. But tonight, Christmas night, he just held his son's drawing and let himself feel grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful to have mattered. Grateful that when 3 strangers knocked on his door in a snowstorm, he'd chosen to answer. The last thing Jake thought before sleep claimed him was that he needed to write a new letter. Not a goodbye letter this time, but a hello. Something that said, I'm still here, and I'm fighting, and I think maybe I'm going to win this time. Something that started with hope instead of ending with despair. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll write it. And for the first time in years, tomorrow felt like a promise instead of a threat. Jake spent 3 more days in the hospital before the doctors cleared him for discharge. 3 days of physical therapy for his shoulder, wound care for his burns, and a parade of visitors that left him exhausted and strangely hopeful in equal measure. Emma and Cody came every afternoon, staying longer each time, the awkwardness between them gradually dissolving into something that felt almost like family again. The FBI agents checked in twice more with updates on the case against Victor Hale, and each time they seemed more confident that the evidence would hold. Laura didn't visit again. Jake understood why. She was already being moved into the witness protection pipeline, her identity being systematically erased and rebuilt somewhere in the bureaucratic depths of the federal system. But on his last morning in the hospital, a nurse brought him an envelope that had been left at the front desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Laura's handwriting, neat and precise despite what must have been written in haste. Jake, by the time you read this, we'll be gone. New names, new city, new lives. The agents say it's the only way to stay safe, and I believe them. But I couldn't leave without telling you one more time what you did for us. You gave us our lives back, not just by fighting those men, though God knows that would have been enough, but by showing us that there are still good people in the world. People who will stand up when it matters. People who will sacrifice everything for strangers simply because it's the right thing to do. Sophie wants you to know that you're the bravest person she's ever met. Maya drew you a picture of a superhero that I had to leave behind because the agent said no personal items, but please know she thinks you have a cape and everything. And I want you to know that you saved more than 3 lives that night. You saved yourself too, even if you don't realize it yet. The man who opened that door wasn't the same man who was sitting with a gun minutes before. Something changed in you when you chose to fight instead of surrender. Hold on to that. Build on it. Become the person you were always meant to be. I wish I could stay and watch you do it. I wish I could be there when you reconcile with your son, when you rebuild your business, when you finally accept that you're worthy of happiness. But wishing doesn't change reality, and reality is that we have to disappear to survive. So this is goodbye, Jake Mason. Thank you for everything. Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being exactly who we needed when we needed it most. Live well. Be happy. And know that somewhere out there, 3 people are thinking of you and wishing you all the best that life has to offer. With gratitude and affection, Laura P.S. The agents tell me that Hale's lawyers are already trying to negotiate a plea deal. They're scared, which means the evidence is solid. You didn't just save our lives, you helped bring down someone who was selling American military secrets to our enemies. You're a hero, whether you accept that label or not. Jake read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his wallet next to Cody's drawing. 2 pieces of paper that represented 2 different futures. One that was ending before it could really begin, and one that was just starting to open up with possibility. The nurse who delivered the envelope lingered in the doorway. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Jake said, surprised to find he meant it. "Everything's going to be okay." They discharged him that afternoon with a prescription for pain medication he had no intention of filling. He'd learned the hard way what happened when broken men tried to medicate their way to peace, and instructions to follow up with his primary care physician in 2 weeks. Emma picked him up in her sensible sedan, Cody bouncing in the back seat with barely contained excitement. "Can Dad come to our house?" Cody asked before Jake had even closed the passenger door. "Please? Just for dinner? I want to show him my room and my new games and—" "Cody, your dad just got out of the hospital," Emma interrupted gently. "He probably wants to go home and rest." But Jake surprised them both by saying, "Actually, dinner sounds great. If the invitation's still open. Emma glanced at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Are you sure? You look exhausted. I am exhausted, Jake admitted. But I'm also tired of being alone. And I'd really like to see Cody's room if that's okay. Yes, Cody pumped his fist in victory, and Emma couldn't quite suppress her smile. Okay then, dinner it is, but we're ordering pizza because I am not cooking after the day I've had. They drove through Winter Park, past houses decorated with Christmas lights and inflatable snowmen, past families sledding in their front yards and kids building forts from the fresh powder. Normal people living normal lives, the kind of normalcy Jake had forgotten was possible. 3 days ago, he'd been ready to exit this world permanently. Now he was riding in his ex-wife's car, listening to his son chatter about Minecraft, heading towards something that felt almost like home. Emma's house was smaller than the one they'd shared during their marriage, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where all the houses looked vaguely similar. But it was clean and warm and decorated with the kind of care that spoke of someone making the best of their circumstances. Cody's artwork covered the refrigerator, and there was a small Christmas tree in the corner, still draped with lights and ornaments. The tree's still up, Jake observed. We had Christmas morning here, but Cody wanted to wait to take it down until you could see it, Emma explained. He decorated most of it himself this year. Jake looked at his son, at the pride shining in his eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. It's beautiful, buddy. Best tree I've ever seen. Cody beamed and grabbed Jake's good hand. Come on, I'll show you my room. The next hour passed in a blur of video game demonstrations, detailed explanations of Pokemon card values, and a tour of Cody's impressive Lego creations. Jake sat on his son's bed and listened and nodded and asked questions, his wounded shoulder throbbing, but his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. This was what he'd been missing. This was what he'd almost thrown away permanently. When the pizza arrived, they ate at Emma's small dining table like a real family, passing plates and napkins and falling into conversation that felt almost natural. Cody dominated the discussion with stories about school and his friends and the new Star Wars movie he wanted to see, but occasionally Emma would catch Jake's eye and something would pass between them. Not romance, not anymore, but recognition. An acknowledgement that they were both trying, both doing their best to build something good from the wreckage of what they'd lost. After dinner, after Cody had been sent to brush his teeth and get ready for bed despite his protests that it was still early, Emma and Jake stood in the kitchen doing dishes in companionable silence. He really missed you, Emma said quietly, her hands deep in soapy water. Even when you were at your worst, even when I had to keep him away for his own safety, he never stopped asking about you, never stopped hoping you'd get better. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty, Jake said. Maybe not, but you have it anyway. Emma rinsed a plate and handed it to him to dry. The question is what you're going to do with it. Jake thought about the letter in his wallet, about Laura's words about becoming the person he was meant to be. I'm going to get help, he said, real help. I already made an appointment with a therapist who specializes in PTSD, and I'm going to start going to the VA support group meetings. Emma's hand stilled in the water. Really? Really? I've spent too long pretending I could handle this on my own. Clearly, that doesn't work. He set the dried plate in the cabinet. And I want to see Cody regularly, every week, if that's okay with you. I want to be part of his life again. Jake? Emma turned to face him, her expression uncertain. I want that too. God knows I want that. But I need to know you're serious. I need to know you're not going to show up for a few weeks and then disappear again when things get hard. I can't promise I won't struggle, Jake said honestly. I can't promise there won't be bad days or setbacks or times when I want to give up. But I can promise I'll keep fighting. I can promise I won't quit on him again. Or yourself, Emma added softly. Don't quit on yourself either. Or myself, Jake agreed. They finished the dishes in silence, and then Cody appeared in his pajamas demanding that his dad read him a bedtime story. Jake followed his son into the small bedroom and settled carefully on the edge of the bed. And for the next 20 minutes he read about dragons and knights and brave heroes who faced impossible odds. When Cody's eyes started to droop, Jake set the book aside and pulled the covers up to his son's chin. Dad? Cody's voice was sleepy, blurred at the edges. Are you going to be okay now? For real? Jake smoothed his son's hair back from his forehead, the gesture familiar and achingly precious. Yeah, buddy, I'm going to be okay. It might take some time, and it might be hard, but I'm going to do everything I can to get better. Good, Cody yawned hugely, because I want you to come to my baseball game next month. Mom signed me up for Little League. I'll be there, Jake promised. Front row, cheering the loudest. Even louder than Coach Stevens? He's really loud. Even louder than that. Cody smiled and closed his eyes, and within minutes his breathing had evened out into sleep. Jake sat there for a long moment, watching his son's peaceful face, before finally standing and quietly leaving the room. Emma was waiting in the living room, and she'd called him a cab. I figured you shouldn't be driving yet, she explained, with the pain medication and everything. I'm not taking the pain medication, Jake said, but you're right about the driving. Thank you. They stood awkwardly by the door, neither quite sure how to end the evening. Finally, Emma said, This was good. Today. Seeing you with Cody, seeing you trying, it was really good. Can we do it again? Next week, maybe? Let's start with phone calls, Emma suggested. You call Cody 3 times a week, just to talk. Then next weekend you can come by for a few hours. We'll build slowly, make sure the foundation is solid before we try to construct anything bigger. Does that work? It wasn't what Jake had hoped for. Some part of him had been harboring fantasies of immediate reconciliation, of stepping back into the life he'd lost like the intervening years had never happened. But it was realistic, and it was fair, and it was more than he'd had this time last week. That works, he said. Thank you, Emma, for giving me another chance. Thank Cody, she replied. He's the one who never gave up on you. I just finally decided to stop standing in his way. The cab pulled up outside and Jake stepped out into the cold December night. As he settled into the back seat and gave the driver his grandfather's cabin address, he realized he was actually looking forward to going home. Not with dread or resignation, but with something that felt almost like anticipation. The cabin looked different in the darkness, or maybe Jake was different, seeing it with new eyes. The front door had been replaced by a contractor the FBI had arranged, but the bullet holes in the walls remained, stark reminders of what had happened here. The bloodstains had been professionally cleaned, but Jake knew where they'd been. He'd always know. But as he walked through the space, turning on lights and stirring the embers in the fireplace back to life, he didn't feel haunted. He felt grateful. This cabin had been meant to be his tomb, but instead it had become the place where he'd remembered how to fight, where he'd found a reason to keep breathing, where he'd discovered that maybe he wasn't as broken as he'd believed. Jake made coffee and sat in his grandfather's chair, the one he'd been sitting in with a gun 3 days ago, and pulled out his phone. The VA support group met Thursday evenings at a church in Denver. He'd learned from a quick internet search. That was tomorrow night. He could make that drive, sit in a circle with other veterans who understood what it was like to come home changed, and maybe start the long process of healing. His finger hovered over the contact information, then he did something he hadn't done in months. He called his sponsor from the AA meetings he'd stopped attending 6 months ago. Jake? Tom's voice was surprised and cautious. Is that really you? Yeah, Tom. It's me. I know I dropped off the face of the earth, and I know you probably think I'm dead or using or... I heard about what happened on the mountain, Tom interrupted. Everyone in the program heard. One of the nurses at the hospital is in the fellowship. She mentioned it at a meeting. Said you saved 3 people from armed killers while you were dealing with your own stuff. Jake didn't know what to say to that. Are you calling because you're ready to come back? Tom asked gently. Because your chair's still here, man. We never gave up on it. I'm ready, Jake said, and the words felt like a weight lifting. I'm really ready this time. Good. There's a meeting tomorrow morning at 10 if you can make it. And Jake, I'm proud of you. Not just for what you did on that mountain, but for making this call. That took guts. They talked for another 20 minutes, Tom catching Jake up on the group and Jake giving the abbreviated version of his last few months. When they finally hung up, Jake felt like he'd taken the first real step forward instead of just treading water or sliding backward. He spent the rest of the evening making calls and sending emails. He contacted the therapist his doctor had recommended and scheduled an initial consultation for the following week. He reached out to his lawyer about the business, asking what it would take to get his contractor's license reinstated. He sent a message to his old foreman asking if any of the crew might be interested in working together again if Jake could get things running. By the time he finally went to bed, it was past midnight and his shoulder was throbbing from overuse, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. He had a plan. He had appointments. He had reasons to wake up tomorrow morning and the morning after that, and all the mornings stretching ahead into a future that no longer looked like a prison sentence. Jake dreamed that night, but for once they weren't nightmares of Kandahar. Instead, he dreamed of Laura and her daughters somewhere safe, living ordinary lives under ordinary names. He dreamed of Cody hitting a home run while Jake cheered from the stands. He dreamed of his grandfather's cabin rebuilt and restored, filled with light and laughter instead of darkness and despair. When he woke on Thursday morning to sunlight streaming through the repaired windows, Jake lay in bed for a moment, just breathing, just being alive, just feeling grateful that when 3 desperate strangers had knocked on his door in a snowstorm, he'd chosen to answer instead of checking out permanently. The AA meeting was exactly as he remembered: bad coffee, uncomfortable folding chairs, and a circle of people who understood addiction in ways that civilians never could. When it was Jake's turn to share, he told them about the gun and the letter and the knock at the door. He told them about fighting for 3 lives and discovering that maybe his own life was worth fighting for too. "I'm Jake," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his gut. "I'm an alcoholic and an addict, and I'm 63 days sober." The room erupted in applause, and Tom caught his eye from across the circle with a proud smile. After the meeting, several people approached Jake to welcome him back and share their own stories of relapse and recovery. A woman named Maria, who'd been sober for 7 years, told him that her turning point had come when her daughter had begged her to get help one more time. "Sometimes we need someone else to show us we're worth saving," she said. "Sounds like those people who showed up at your cabin did that for you." "They did," Jake agreed. "And now I have to figure out how to live up to that." "One day at a time," Maria said. "That's all any of us can do." The PTSD support group that evening was harder. Sitting in a room full of veterans who carried the same invisible wounds he did, listening to their stories of flashbacks and hypervigilance and relationships destroyed by trauma, it forced Jake to confront things he'd been avoiding for years. He didn't share during his first meeting, just listened and absorbed and felt less alone than he had in a very long time. Afterward, a former Army Ranger named Marcus approached him in the parking lot. "You're the guy from the news," he said without preamble. "The Marine who killed 5 contractors trying to murder that CEO." Jake tensed, unsure where this was going. "Yeah, that's me." "I wanted to tell you something." Marcus's expression was serious, intense. "I've been coming to these meetings for 2 years, and every single week I wonder if it's worth it. If any of this is worth it. If I should just end it and stop being a burden to everyone who has to deal with my broken ass." "Marcus, but then I heard what you did. How you were literally seconds from suicide when someone knocked, and you chose to fight instead. You chose to matter." Marcus's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And I thought, if that guy can turn it around in the space of a few minutes, if he can go from wanting to die to being willing to die for strangers, then maybe I can figure out how to keep breathing for one more day." Jake didn't know what to say. He'd never thought of himself as inspirational, never imagined that his desperate last stand might mean something to anyone beyond the 3 people he'd saved. "You helped me," Marcus said simply. "Without knowing it, without trying, you helped me. So thank you. And keep coming to these meetings, because I guarantee you're not the only one here who needs to hear your story." They exchanged numbers, and Jake drove home in a daze. It was one thing to save lives in the moment, in the heat of combat when there was no time to think or question. But it was something else entirely to realize that his survival might matter to people he'd never met, that his choice to keep fighting might inspire others to do the same. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Jake went to AA meetings 3 times a week and the PTSD group every Thursday. He started physical therapy for his shoulder and occupational therapy for his burned hand. He called Cody every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday without fail, conversations that started awkward but gradually grew easier. He met with his therapist twice a week and did the hard work of unpacking decades of trauma and grief and self-loathing. It wasn't easy. There were days when he woke up and the weight of everything seemed crushing, when the idea of getting out of bed felt impossible. There were nights when the nightmares came back and he woke gasping and reaching for weapons that weren't there. There were moments when he passed the drawer where he'd kept the gun and had to force himself to keep walking instead of checking to see if the weapon was still there. But there were good days too. Days when Cody's laughter on the phone made everything feel worthwhile. Days when the physical therapy showed real progress and he could lift his arm higher than the day before. Days when he sat in the AA meeting and realized he'd made it another week sober, another week alive, another week moving forward instead of sliding back. 2 weeks after his discharge from the hospital, Jake's lawyer called with surprising news. "The insurance company is willing to settle," she said without preamble. "The accident that bankrupted your business, turns out the other driver's coverage is actually going to pay out. It's not everything you lost, but it's enough to clear your debts and maybe get you started again." Jake sat down heavily in his grandfather's chair. "How much?" $75,000 after legal fees. "And your contractor's license has been reinstated. The board reviewed your case and agreed that the suspension was overly harsh given the circumstances." $75,000. Not a fortune, but enough to buy equipment, hire a small crew, start taking jobs again. Enough to rebuild instead of just surviving. "There's something else," his lawyer continued. "The FBI called me yesterday. They wanted you to know that Victor Hale took a plea deal. 25 years in federal prison for espionage, conspiracy, and attempted murder. No parole eligibility for at least 15 years. "What about Laura?" Jake asked. "Is she safe now?" "They didn't give me details, but the impression I got was that with Hale behind bars and his organization dismantled, the threat level has dropped significantly. Whether that means she can come out of witness protection or not, I don't know." Jake thanked her and ended the call, then sat staring at the fireplace for a long time. Hale was in prison. Laura and her daughters were safe. And Jake had enough money to start rebuilding his life in concrete, practical ways. It felt like the universe was conspiring to give him reasons to keep going, like every door he approached was opening instead of slamming shut. The following Saturday, Emma invited him to Cody's Little League practice. Jake stood behind the backstop with the other parents, watching his son field ground balls and take awkward swings at batting practice, and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with athletic prowess and everything to do with just being present. Being there. Being the dad he'd promised to be. "He's getting better," Emma observed, standing beside Jake with her arms crossed against the early spring chill. "Last week he couldn't catch anything. Now he's at least getting his glove in the right position." "He looks great," Jake said, and meant it. "You look better too," Emma said quietly. "Healthier. Like you're actually sleeping." "Some nights," Jake admitted. "The therapy helps, and staying sober helps, and having a reason to get up in the morning definitely helps." Emma glanced at him, something calculating in her expression. "Jake, can I ask you something? When you were sitting in that cabin with the gun, what changed? What made you answer the door instead of finishing what you'd started?" Jake thought about this, trying to find words for something that had happened mostly on instinct. "I don't know if anything changed in that exact moment," he said finally. "I think I was just so used to responding to emergencies that I did it automatically. Someone was in danger, someone needed help, and I reacted before I could think about it." "But you could have sent them away," Emma pressed. "After you saw what the situation was, you could have told them you couldn't help and closed the door." "I could have," Jake agreed. "But then I'd have known I'd let 3 people die to preserve my own plan to die. And even at my lowest, I guess I couldn't do that. I couldn't be that person." "You were never that person," Emma said. "That's what I've been trying to tell you for years. The drinking, the anger, the depression, that wasn't the real you. That was the broken you. The real you is the man who opens doors for strangers and fights impossible odds to protect people he doesn't know." "I don't know if there's a difference," Jake said. "I think maybe I'm both people, the broken one and the fighter. And I'm trying to figure out how to be more of the second and less of the first." On the field, Cody hit a line drive that made it all the way to the outfield. He stood at first base grinning like he'd just won the World Series, and Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You're doing it," Emma said softly, "figuring it out. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than any of the bullets from that night in the cabin. Emma's pride, Emma's approval, He'd spent years believing he'd forfeited any right to those things. Hearing them now, standing in the spring sunshine, watching their son play baseball like a normal kid with normal parents who were trying their best, felt like a kind of redemption he hadn't known was possible. After practice, they got ice cream. Jake, Emma, and Cody crowded into a booth at the local parlor, arguing good-naturedly about which flavor was best. And sitting there, listening to Cody's animated description of the line drive he'd hit and Emma's teasing commentary, Jake realized something profound. He was happy. Not perfectly happy, not without complications or concerns or the lingering shadows of trauma, but happy in a real substantial way. Happy to be alive. Happy to be here. Happy to have fought his way back from the edge to this moment, this ice cream, this family that wasn't quite whole, but was trying. A month after the incident, Jake hired his first employee for the revived construction business, his old foreman, Mike, who'd stayed loyal despite everything. They took a small job repairing a deck in Winter Park, and Jake found himself remembering why he'd loved this work in the first place. The satisfaction of fixing things, building things, making concrete improvements to the world with his hands. "It's good to have you back, boss," Mike said at the end of their first day, surveying the completed repair with professional satisfaction. "The work, the quality, it's like you never left." "Feels good to be back," Jake admitted. "Feels good to be useful again." They started taking more jobs, slowly building a reputation again. Word spread about Jake's story, the disabled Marine who'd saved 3 lives and was now putting his life back together, and people wanted to hire him, wanted to support him. Jake was uncomfortable with the attention at first, unused to being seen as anything other than a failure or a cautionary tale, but he learned to accept the kindness, to let people help the way he'd helped Laura and her daughters. 2 months after the shooting, Jake went to visit his grandfather's grave in the small cemetery outside Winter Park. He'd avoided it for years, ashamed to face even the memory of a man who'd been so strong when Jake felt so weak. But now, kneeling in the grass beside the headstone, he found words coming easier than expected. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I let your cabin become the place where I almost ended things. You built that place as a sanctuary, and I almost turned it into a tomb." The wind rustled through the pine trees surrounding the cemetery, and Jake could almost imagine it was his grandfather's voice, patient and understanding. "But I'm okay now," he continued, "or I'm getting there anyway. I'm doing the work. I'm showing up. I'm being the man you tried to teach me to be." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I'm using the cabin the way you intended, as a place of peace, a place to remember what matters." He stayed there for a while, just sitting in the grass and letting the mountain air wash over him. When he finally stood to leave, he felt lighter somehow, like he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. That evening, Jake attended his PTSD support group as usual, but this time, when the facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share, Jake raised his hand. "I'm Jake," he said to the circle of familiar faces. "Marine Corps veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan. And I want to tell you about the night I almost killed myself." He told them everything. The bankruptcy, the divorce, the growing isolation and despair, the gun on the table, the letter to his son, the moment when he'd been seconds from pulling the trigger, and then the knock at the door, the strangers who needed help, the firefight that had somehow saved him from himself. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that one good deed fixed everything," Jake said, "because it didn't. I still have nightmares. I still have days when getting out of bed feels impossible. I still struggle with feeling like I'm worth the space I take up in the world." He paused, looking around the circle at faces that reflected his own pain back at him. "But what that night taught me is that we never know when we're going to matter. We never know when someone's going to need exactly what we have to offer, even if what we have to offer is just a door that opens when they knock. And if we check out early, if we make that permanent choice, we rob ourselves of every moment that comes after, every chance to matter, every possibility of mattering." Marcus, the ranger who'd approached him after his first meeting, spoke up. "How do you keep going on the days when you can't see the point?" "Honestly, some days I just make it to the next AA meeting, or the next phone call with my son, or the next therapy session." Jake shrugged. "I break it down into smaller pieces until it feels manageable. And I remind myself that Laura and her daughters are alive because I didn't pull that trigger. That my son still has a father because I opened a door instead. That maybe, somewhere down the line, I'll matter to someone else in a way I can't predict or plan for. After the meeting, several people thanked Jake for sharing, said his words had helped them. One woman told him she'd been planning her own exit that week, but would give it another few days now. Another veteran asked Jake to be his sponsor, said he needed someone who understood both the military trauma and the civilian struggle. Jake agreed to all of it, humbled and slightly overwhelmed by the idea that his pain and survival might serve a purpose beyond just his own redemption. 3 months after Christmas Eve, Emma called with unexpected news. "Cody wants you to come to his spring concert at school," she said. "He's playing trumpet in the band, and he specifically asked if his dad would be there." Jake's schedule showed a big job that day, a full kitchen renovation that couldn't be easily rescheduled, but he didn't even hesitate. "I'll be there. Front row." "Jake, you don't have to eat—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I've missed too many things already. I'm not missing this." He showed up at Cody's school in clean clothes with his hair combed, and he sat in the uncomfortable auditorium seat surrounded by other parents and felt utterly content. When Cody's class took the stage and began their stumbling rendition of a pop song arranged for middle school band, Jake found himself blinking back tears. His son was up there, alive and healthy and normal and doing all the things that normal kids do. And Jake was here to witness it, not drunk, not absent, not dead in a mountain cabin, but present and sober and grateful beyond words for the chance to be part of this mundane, beautiful moment. After the concert, Cody ran to him with shining eyes. "Did you hear me? I only messed up twice." "You were incredible," Jake said, pulling his son into a careful hug. "Best trumpet player up there." "That's not true. Kevin is way better, but thanks, Dad." Cody beamed up at him. "Are you coming to dinner with us? Mom said we could get burgers if you want to come." Jake looked at Emma, who nodded permission. "Yeah, buddy, I'd love to." They went to a local burger place. The three of them crowded into a booth, and it felt so normal that Jake had to remind himself this was real. This wasn't a dream or a fantasy or something he'd lost forever. This was his life now, rebuilt from the ashes of what he'd almost destroyed. "Jake," Emma said as they were finishing their meals, "I've been thinking about something." "Yeah?" "The custody arrangement. I think we should make it more formal. Regular visitation, maybe every other weekend plus one evening a week. And summers. Maybe Cody could spend part of the summer with you, if you're comfortable with that." Jake set down his burger, his heart suddenly racing. "Are you serious?" "You've been showing up," Emma said simply. "For 3 months now, you've been consistent. You call when you say you will. You come to the things you promise to come to. You're sober. You're in therapy. You're doing the work." She paused. "You're being the father Cody deserves. And I think it's time we recognize that officially." "Yes," Jake said, his voice rough. "God, yes. I would love that." Cody looked between his parents with cautious hope. "Does this mean Dad's really back? Like, for real this time?" Jake reached across the table and took his son's hand. "For real this time, buddy. I promise." That night, alone in the cabin, Jake pulled out the letter Laura had left him and read it again. Her words about becoming the person he was meant to be, about holding on to the change that had happened when he'd chosen to fight. And he realized that he was doing exactly that, building, day by day, choice by choice, into someone who was worth his son's faith and his ex-wife's cautious trust. Someone who answered doors instead of closing them permanently. Someone who fought instead of surrendered. Someone who understood that mattering wasn't about grand heroic gestures, though those had their place, but about showing up consistently for the small, ordinary moments that actually constituted a life. Jake sat down at his grandfather's desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. But instead of a goodbye letter this time, he wrote something different. "Dear Cody, your mom and I have been apart for a long time, and I know that's been hard on you. I know I've been absent more than I've been present, and I know I've let you down in ways that must have hurt. But I want you to know something important. You never let me down. Not once. Even when I was at my worst, even when I didn't deserve it, you kept believing I could be better. You kept hoping I would come back. And that hope, that faith you had in me, it saved my life. I'm writing this to make you a promise, not a promise that I'll be perfect, because I won't be. Not a promise that there won't be hard days, because there will be, but a promise that I will keep showing up. I will keep fighting to be the dad you deserve. I will keep choosing to be present in your life, no matter how difficult it gets. You drew me a picture that said, my dad is brave. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that. I love you more than words can say. Dad. He folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope addressed to Cody. He'd give it to him this weekend when he came by for their newly official visitation. Not as a replacement for showing up, but as a supplement to it. As proof that he was thinking about these things, working on them, committed to the long process of rebuilding what he'd broken. Jake looked around the cabin, at the repaired windows, at the patched bullet holes, at the space that had almost been his final monument to failure, but had instead become the birthplace of his second chance. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt proud, not of the violence or the killing or the drama of that night, but of the choice he'd made when someone knocked. The choice to open instead of close, to fight instead of surrender, to live instead of die. And he felt ready for whatever came next because he finally understood the truth Laura had tried to tell him in her letter. Redemption wasn't about one dramatic moment. It was about the accumulation of smaller choices, made day after day to be better than you were yesterday, to keep the door open, to keep fighting, to keep showing up. Jake Mason was alive, and for the first time in a long time he was glad about it. 6 months had passed since that Christmas Eve, when Jake's life had split into before and after, and he stood now in the lobby of the federal courthouse in Denver, holding a folder of paperwork that represented everything he'd built back from nothing. The custody modification hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and Emma had texted him twice already to make sure he remembered, as if he could possibly forget the day that would officially recognize him as a present, functioning father again. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from Cody. Good luck, Dad. Mom says if the judge says yes, we can get ice cream after. Jake smiled and typed back. The judge is definitely saying yes. Start thinking about what flavor you want. The confidence wasn't bravado. His lawyer had assured him that the modification was essentially a formality at this point. 6 months of clean drug tests, consistent therapy attendance, steady employment, and 0 missed visitations had built a case file that spoke for itself. Emma was supporting the change, which eliminated any potential conflict. The judge would review, ask a few questions, and sign the papers that would give Jake joint custody with graduated parenting time. Jake Mason? A bailiff appeared in the hallway. Judge Morrison is ready for you. The hearing itself was anticlimactic in the best possible way. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the file while Jake sat beside his lawyer at the defendant's table. Emma sat on the other side with her own attorney, and the whole proceeding felt more like a business meeting than the emotional reckoning Jake had been bracing himself for. Mr. Mason, the judge said finally, looking up from the paperwork. I've reviewed your history with the court, and I'll be frank. 18 months ago, I would have denied this petition without hesitation. Your record showed substance abuse, untreated PTSD, financial instability, and concerning behavior that put your son at risk. Jake's stomach clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. However, Judge Morrison continued, and her tone softened slightly, the documentation before me today tells a very different story. 6 months of sobriety, confirmed by random drug testing, consistent mental health treatment with measurable progress, stable employment and housing, and most importantly, 6 months of reliable, engaged parenting during your supervised visits. She paused. Ms. Mason, you're supporting this modification? Emma stood. I am, Your Honor. Jake has done everything we asked of him and more. He's proven that he's committed to being a good father, and Cody deserves to have both his parents actively involved in his life. The judge nodded and signed the papers with a flourish. Joint legal custody is granted, with a graduated parenting time schedule beginning with alternate weekends and expanding to include summer visitation after 1 year of successful transition. Mr. Mason, I'm going to be very clear with you. This is your second chance. If you relapse, if you miss scheduled visitations, if you give me any reason to believe you're putting your son at risk, I will reverse this order without hesitation. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. I understand, and I won't let you down, or my son. See that you don't. Judge Morrison's expression softened into something almost like approval. Good luck, Mr. Mason. Not everyone gets the opportunity to rebuild what they've broken. Make the most of it. Outside the courthouse, Emma turned to Jake with a smile that was complicated but genuine. You did it. You really did it. We did it, Jake corrected. You could have fought this. You could have made it impossible. Thank you for believing I could change. Cody believed it first, Emma said. I just finally caught up. She glanced at her watch. I have to get back to work, but Cody's expecting you to pick him up from school at 3. First official custody pickup. Are you ready? I've been ready for 6 months, Jake said. But yeah, I'm ready. He spent the intervening hours at a job site, finishing up a bathroom renovation for a client in Boulder. Mike had taken on most of the day-to-day management of the business, which freed Jake up to focus on the more complex projects and maintain the therapy schedule that had become the backbone of his recovery. They'd hired 2 more employees in the past month, and the calendar was booked solid through the end of summer. The business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. At 2:45, Jake cleaned up, changed into a fresh shirt he'd brought for the occasion, and drove to Cody's school. He'd picked his son up before during the supervised visits, but this felt different. This was official. This was the first day of what would hopefully be many years of shared custody, of being the kind of father who showed up not because a court mandated it, but because he wanted to. Cody exploded out of the school building at 3:07, backpack bouncing, and ran straight to Jake's truck. Dad, did the judge say yes? The judge said yes, Jake confirmed, and Cody let out a whoop that made several other parents turn to stare. Can we go to the cabin this weekend? Mom said if you got custody, I could stay overnight with you, and I want to see where you fought the bad guys. Jake had been dreading this question. The cabin held complicated memories, both the darkest moment of his life and the moment that had pulled him back from the edge. He'd cleaned it up, repaired the damage, even redecorated slightly to make it feel less like a crime scene and more like a home. But showing it to his son, explaining what had happened there, felt like exposing Cody to darkness that maybe a 10-year-old didn't need to carry. We can go to the cabin, Jake said carefully as Cody buckled his seatbelt. But buddy, I want you to understand something. What happened there that night? It wasn't like the movies. It was scary and violent, and people died. I'm not proud of the killing. I'm only proud that I kept those people safe. I know, Dad. Cody's voice was suddenly serious, older than his years. Mom told me you were sad before the lady knocked on the door. She said you were so sad you almost did something really bad. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She told you that? Not the details. But I'm not stupid. I know what really bad means. Cody looked at his father with those enormous dark eyes. Were you going to kill yourself? There was no point in lying. Cody was smart, observant, and he deserved honesty even when honesty was hard. Yeah, buddy, I was. I was in a really dark place, and I couldn't see any way forward. I thought everyone would be better off without me. But then the lady and her kids came. Then they came, and I realized I was wrong. That I still had things to offer, that my life still mattered. Jake pulled into the ice cream shop parking lot and turned to face his son. And the biggest thing I realized was that you deserved better than a dad who gave up. You deserved someone who would fight to be there for you, no matter how hard it got. Cody was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then he said, I'm glad they knocked on your door. Me too, buddy. Jake's voice was rough. Me too. They got ice cream, Rocky Road for Cody, plain vanilla for Jake, and sat in a booth talking about school and baseball and Cody's upcoming birthday. Normal father-son conversation, the kind Jake had once thought he'd lost the right to forever. And sitting there listening to his son's animated description of a science project involving volcanoes, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude that still sometimes caught him off guard. He was here. He was sober. He was present. He was doing the thing he'd once believed was impossible. That Friday evening, Jake picked Cody up for their first official overnight visit. They stopped at the grocery store to buy supplies for breakfast, and Cody insisted on choosing everything himself. chocolate chip pancake mix, bacon, orange juice, and a cantaloupe that he promised he knew how to cut, even though Jake had serious doubts. The drive up to the cabin was beautiful in the late spring evening, the mountains painted gold by the setting sun. Cody chattered the whole way, pointing out landmarks and asking questions about the wildlife. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, he went silent, staring at the building with wide eyes. "This is it?" he asked quietly. "This is it," Jake confirmed. They went inside, and Jake watched his son take in the space, the repaired windows, the patched walls, the furniture that had been rearranged and updated. The cabin looked different than it had that Christmas Eve, but the bones were the same. This was still the place where Jake had almost ended his story, and the place where three strangers had given him reason to continue it. "Where did you fight them?" Cody asked, his voice hushed like they were in a museum. Jake pointed to various locations. "One came through that window, 2 came through the front door after they blew it open. The others I got from here, using the stone fireplace as cover. And the lady, Laura, she shot one of them?" "She saved my life," Jake said simply. "I was down, wounded, and one of them was about to finish me. She picked up my rifle and dropped him with one shot, even though she'd never fired a gun before in her life." Cody walked slowly around the cabin, running his hands over surfaces like he could feel the history embedded in them. When he reached the table where Jake had laid out the gun and the letter, he stopped. "Is this where you were sitting when they knocked?" Jake's throat tightened. "Yeah, buddy, right there." "What were you thinking about?" "Before they came." How did you explain despair to a 10-year-old? How did you articulate the weight of failure and shame and exhaustion that had pressed down until breathing felt like too much effort? Jake settled for the simplest truth he could manage. "I was thinking that I'd let everyone down, that I was a burden instead of a blessing, that the world would be better off without one more broken veteran taking up space." He moved to stand beside his son, both of them looking at the chair like it was an exhibit. "But I was wrong, Cody, so completely wrong. Because the world needed me to open that door. Those 3 people needed me to be there, and you needed me to choose to stay alive so I could be your dad again." Cody turned and hugged him fiercely, his small arms surprisingly strong. "I always needed you, Dad, even when you were sick, even when Mom said you couldn't visit. I always wanted you to get better and come back." Jake hugged his son back, careful of his still healing shoulder, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd almost thrown away. This moment, this connection, this chance to be present for all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that constituted a childhood. They spent the evening playing cards and roasting marshmallows in the fireplace, and Cody asked occasional questions about that night, always factual, never sensational, just trying to understand the story that had changed his father's trajectory. Jake answered honestly, but without graphic details, walking the line between honesty and age-appropriateness. When Cody finally went to bed in the cabin's small guest room, Jake sat in his grandfather's chair and thought about the letter he'd written that night. The FBI had destroyed it as he'd requested, but he still remembered every word. All those apologies and justifications for giving up, preserved in his memory like a scar. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "How's the first overnight going?" Jake typed back, "Perfect. He's asleep. We talked about that night. He handled it better than I expected. He's stronger than we give him credit for," came Emma's reply. "Like his dad." Jake stared at those words for a long moment. Like his dad. 6 months ago, that comparison would have felt like a curse. Now it felt like hope. The possibility that maybe the strength he'd shown that Christmas Eve wasn't an aberration, but something that had always been there, buried under trauma and self-medication, but waiting to emerge when it was needed most. The weekend passed in a blur of breakfast-making disasters, a hike to a nearby waterfall, and an attempt at fishing that resulted in Cody catching a tree branch and Jake catching nothing at all. Normal father-son activities, the kind that built memories slowly and steadily. On Sunday afternoon, Jake drove Cody back to Emma's house, and his son was already asking about next weekend before they'd even pulled into the driveway. "Same time next Friday?" Jake confirmed. "Can we try fishing again? I want to actually catch a fish this time." "Deal. But you have to practice your knot tying this week." Emma met them at the door, and Jake could see the question in her eyes before she asked it. How did it really go? "It was great," Jake assured her quietly, while Cody ran inside to tell her about the trip. Really great. Thank you for this, Emma, for giving me this chance. You earned it, she said simply. Then, after a pause, there's something I want to talk to you about. Not now, but soon. Something I've been thinking about. Okay. Just tell me when. She nodded and headed inside, leaving Jake in the driveway with a mix of curiosity and concern. But he'd learned in the past 6 months that not everything needed to be resolved immediately, that sometimes patience was its own form of strength. The following week brought unexpected news from an unexpected source. Agent Chen from the FBI called Jake on a Tuesday afternoon while he was at a job site, her voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately set off his internal alarms. Mr. Mason, I wanted to give you an update on the Bennett case, she said. Victor Hale is in federal prison, as you know, but there have been some developments regarding Mrs. Bennett and her daughters. Jake's heart rate kicked up. Are they okay? Did something happen? They're fine. Actually, the situation has improved significantly. With Hale incarcerated and his organization dismantled, our threat assessment indicates the risk level has dropped to near zero. Which means, Chen paused, and Jake could hear papers rustling. Which means Mrs. Bennett has petitioned to exit witness protection and resume her normal identity. Jake sat down heavily on a stack of lumber. She's coming back? She's already back. She returned to Colorado 3 weeks ago and has been going through the reintegration process. She wanted to wait until everything was settled before reaching out to anyone from her old life. Another pause. Including you. She asked me to give you her new contact information, if you're interested. Yes, Jake said immediately. Absolutely yes. Chen rattled off a phone number and an address in Boulder, and Jake wrote them down with shaking hands. Laura was back. After 6 months of wondering if he'd ever know whether she and the girls were okay, whether they were happy, whether they'd managed to build something good from the ashes of that terrifying night, now he could find out. He called the number as soon as Chen hung up, before he could overthink it or talk himself out of it. The phone rang 3 times, and then, "Hello?" Her voice was the same, calm, intelligent, with an undercurrent of warmth that Jake remembered from their brief time together. "Laura, it's Jake Mason." A sharp intake of breath. "Jake. Oh my God, Jake. Agent Chen said she was going to contact you, but I didn't know if you'd actually call." "Of course I called. I've been wondering about you guys for 6 months. How are you? How are Sophie and Maya?" "We're good. Really good, actually. Settled in Boulder, the girls are enrolled in school. I'm back at work. Well, a different position at Bennett Technologies, but still. We're rebuilding." Her voice softened. "And we've wanted to reach out to you so many times. To thank you properly. To see how you're doing." "I'm good too," Jake said, and realized he meant it. "Sober. In therapy. Got joint custody of my son. Started the business back up. Everything you said I should do in that letter you left. I'm doing it." "I knew you would." Laura sounded like she was crying. "I told the girls you would. That you were too strong not to find your way back." They talked for almost an hour, catching up on 6 months compressed into bullet points and highlights. Laura told him about witness protection, the strange experience of living under a false name in a small town in Montana, always looking over their shoulder, never quite able to relax. Sophie had struggled with nightmares and anxiety. Maya had become clingy and fearful of strangers, but therapy had helped them too, and the knowledge that Hale was in prison had lifted a weight they'd been carrying since that Christmas Eve. "The girls ask about you constantly," Laura said. "They want to see you, to thank you in person. Would you be willing to meet up sometime? Maybe coffee or lunch or whatever feels comfortable?" "I'd love that," Jake said without hesitation. "Just name the time and place." They made plans to meet the following Saturday at a cafe in Boulder, and Jake spent the rest of the week in a state of anticipation that surprised him with its intensity. He'd saved their lives, yes, but they'd saved his too. And he'd spent 6 months wondering if he'd ever get to see the results of that mutual rescue, ever get to know if the fight had been worth it beyond just the immediate survival. Saturday arrived with unusual spring warmth, and Jake drove to Boulder dressed in his best jeans and a button-down shirt that Emma had helped him pick out. The cafe was one of those trendy places with reclaimed wood and expensive coffee drinks, and Jake felt distinctly out of place until he spotted them through the window. Laura sat at a corner table with Sophie and Maya on either side of her, and all three of them looked healthy and whole, and nothing like the desperate, terrified people who'd pounded on his door 6 months ago. They'd put on weight, their faces had filled out, and there was a lightness to their body language that spoke of safety reclaimed. When Laura saw him, she stood so quickly she nearly knocked over her coffee. Sophie and Maya turned, and Maya let out a squeal that was definitely too loud for the refined cafe atmosphere. "Jake!" She launched herself at him before he'd fully entered, wrapping her arms around his waist with the kind of enthusiasm that only 7-year-olds could manage. "You came! You really came!" Sophie was more reserved but no less emotional, waiting her turn to hug him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for saving us." Laura approached last, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other. Then she embraced him carefully, mindful of his still healing injuries, and Jake could feel her shaking. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said against his shoulder. "I thought that night would be the only time, that we'd just be ghosts to each other, always wondering." "Me too," Jake admitted, "but I'm really glad Agent Chen called." They settled at the table, and the girls peppered Jake with questions faster than he could answer them. How was his shoulder? Had his hand healed properly? Did he still live in the cabin? Had he gotten in trouble for shooting those men? The questions were frank and curious, without the traumatized edge Jake had worried about. "We're in therapy," Sophie explained when Jake commented on how well they seemed to be doing. "Dr. Rodriguez helps us talk about scary things so they don't stay scary. She said that what happened to us was really bad, but we survived it, and surviving makes us stronger." "Your Dr. Rodriguez sounds smart," Jake said. "She is, and she says you're a hero, like an actual hero, not just a movie one." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know about hero. I just did what needed doing." "That's what heroes do," Maya said matter-of-factly. "They do the hard things even when they're scared." Laura caught Jake's eye and smiled. "You'll have to forgive them. They've decided you're their personal superhero, and no amount of argument from me can convince them otherwise." "Mom says you were sad before we came to your door," Sophie said, and her directness reminded Jake so much of Cody it was startling. "She says you were thinking about giving up. Is that true?" Jake glanced at Laura, who nodded permission to be honest. "Yeah, it's true. I was in a really dark place, and I couldn't see a way forward. But then you guys showed up, and you gave me a reason to keep going." "So we saved you too," Maya said with satisfaction. "Mom said we did, but I wanted to make sure." "You definitely did," Jake confirmed. "All three of you saved my life just as much as I saved yours." They spent 2 hours at the cafe, talking and laughing, and sharing stories about the past 6 months. Laura told him about returning to Bennett Technologies in a consulting role that gave her more control over her schedule, allowing her to focus on the girls' recovery. Sophie shared that she'd joined a soccer team and discovered she was pretty good at defense. Maya proudly displayed the artwork she'd been creating in therapy, including several pieces that depicted the hero who saved us, with distinctly superhero-like qualities Jake definitely didn't possess. When they finally stood to leave, Laura pulled Jake aside while the girls were distracted with choosing cookies from the display case. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something I've been working up the courage to say for months." Jake's chest tightened. "Okay." "That night in the cabin, when I saw the gun and the letter, when I realized what you'd been about to do," Laura's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I've never been more terrified and more grateful at the same time. Terrified of what we'd interrupted, but grateful beyond words that we'd interrupted it. And I want you to know that it wasn't just chance. It wasn't just luck or timing." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I prayed, Jake. When we were running through that storm, when I was carrying Maya and pulling Sophie through the snow, and I knew we were going to freeze to death if we didn't find shelter, I prayed harder than I've ever prayed in my life. I asked God or the universe or whatever's out there to send us help, to send us someone strong enough to protect us and brave enough to fight for us." She gripped his hand tightly, "And then your light appeared through the trees, and you opened the door, and you were exactly who I'd prayed for." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been religious, had lost whatever faith he'd possessed in the dust and blood of Kandahar. But standing here, looking at this woman and her daughters, who were alive and healing because of one impossible night, he couldn't entirely dismiss the idea that maybe something larger had been at work. "I'm glad I could be that person," he said finally, "even if I didn't feel like him at the time." "You were always that person," Laura said firmly. "You just needed someone to knock on your door to remember it." They exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch, and the girls made Jake swear he'd come to Maya's birthday party next month. As he drove back to Denver, Jake felt something settling into place in his chest, a piece of the puzzle he'd been missing for 6 months. Closure, maybe, or confirmation that the fight had meant something beyond just the immediate survival. Laura and her daughters were thriving. They'd taken the trauma of that night and transformed it into resilience, into a story about survival and strength rather than just victimhood. And somehow, impossibly, they'd managed to do the same thing for him. That evening, Jake called the number Emma had given him and asked if they could have that talk she'd mentioned. They met at a coffee shop near her house, the conversation starting awkward but quickly finding its rhythm. "I wanted to talk to you about something that might be complicated," Emma began, stirring her latte nervously. "And I want you to know there's no pressure, no expectations, but I've been thinking about it a lot, and I felt like I should at least put it out there." "Okay," Jake said cautiously. "Cody's birthday is next month. He's turning 11. And he asked me," Emma paused, seeming to gather courage. "He asked if you could be there, not just to visit, but to help plan it, to be part of it the way you used to be when we were together." "Of course I want to be there," Jake said immediately. "I wouldn't miss it." "That's not all." Emma met his eyes. "He asked if we could have the party together, the three of us, like a family." Jake's heart stuttered. "Emma, I'm not saying we should get back together," she clarified quickly. "That ship has sailed, and I think we both know it. But maybe we could be friends, co-parents who actually like each other and can be in the same room without tension, partners in raising our son, even if we're not partners in anything else." Jake felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'd like that. I'd really like that. And maybe," Emma hesitated, "maybe you could bring Laura and her girls. Cody's been asking about them since you told him the story. He wants to meet the people who saved his dad. You'd be okay with that? Jake, you saved 3 lives and rebuilt your own in the process. I think the least I can do is share a birthday party with the people who made that possible." She smiled, and it was genuine. "Besides, Cody's right. They're part of your story now, part of our story. They should be included." They spent the next hour planning Cody's party, and it felt easier than anything between them had felt in years. They laughed about Cody's insistence on a specific superhero theme, debated the merits of various cake flavors, and divided responsibilities with the kind of cooperation that had once been routine but had become impossible during Jake's descent. As Jake drove home that night, he realized that this ordinary evening spent planning a child's birthday party, was what redemption actually looked like. Not dramatic firefights or heroic sacrifices, but the quiet work of rebuilding relationships one conversation at a time, the steady accumulation of small choices that added up to a life worth living. His phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "The girls haven't stopped talking about seeing you today. Thank you for being willing to meet us. It meant the world." Jake typed back, "Thank you for letting me be part of your lives. You guys mean more to me than you probably realize." Her response came quickly. "The feeling is mutual. You're family now, whether you like it or not. Family." The word sat in Jake's chest with unexpected weight. 6 months ago, he'd been convinced he had nothing and no one, that he was alone in his suffering, isolated by choices and circumstances he couldn't overcome. But somehow, impossibly, he'd accumulated a family that extended beyond biology and marriage certificates. Cody and Emma, rebuilding trust and connection slowly but surely. Laura and her daughters, bound to him by shared trauma and mutual rescue. The veterans in his support group, fighting the same battles he was fighting. His employees, who'd taken a chance on a broken man trying to put himself back together. Even Marcus, the Army Ranger who'd approached him after his first PTSD meeting, and who now called him weekly to check in and share progress. None of these connections looked like what Jake had imagined family should look like, but they were real, and they were solid, and they were built on honesty and effort rather than obligation and history. That night, Jake sat in his grandfather's chair and pulled out his journal, a practice his therapist had recommended and he'd initially resisted but had grown to value. He wrote about the meeting with Laura and the girls, about Emma's invitation to co-parent as friends, about the steady accumulation of evidence that his life had value and purpose beyond just survival. And at the bottom of the entry, he wrote something that surprised him with its simplicity and truth. I'm happy. Not perfect, not healed, not without struggles, but genuinely, substantially happy. Who knew that was possible? The weeks leading up to Cody's birthday passed in a flurry of planning and preparation. Jake worked with Emma to organize the party, and they fell into an easy rhythm that reminded him of the early days of their marriage before war and trauma had poisoned everything. Laura and her daughters were invited, as were several of Cody's school friends and Emma's family members who'd written Jake off years ago but were cautiously willing to give him another chance. Jake spent a weekend building Cody a treehouse in Emma's backyard, something his son had wanted for years but they'd never gotten around to completing. He worked through the physical pain in his shoulder and the lingering stiffness in his burned hand, and the labor felt like penance and celebration combined. Every nail he drove, every board he secured felt like a promise kept, like proof that he could build instead of just breaking things. When Cody saw the finished treehouse the day before his birthday, his face lit up with pure joy. "Dad, it's perfect. Can I sleep in it tonight?" "That's between you and your mom," Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I built it solid. It'll hold you." Cody climbed the ladder immediately, disappearing into the small structure, and Jake heard him whooping with delight. Emma appeared beside him, surveying his work with an appraising eye. "It's beautiful," she said. "Really beautiful. You always were good with your hands." "Thanks for letting me build it here," Jake said. "I know this is your house, your space. I appreciate you welcoming me into it." "You're Cody's father," Emma said simply. "This is where he lives, which means you should be welcome here. I should have remembered that sooner." The party itself was chaos in the best way possible. A dozen 11-year-olds hopped up on sugar and excitement, running through the yard playing elaborate games only they understood the rules to. Laura arrived with Sophie and Maya, and the girls immediately gravitated toward Cody, who'd been nervously anticipating meeting them for weeks. "You're the ones my dad saved," he announced proudly, and Jake winced at the lack of subtlety. But Sophie just grinned. "Yeah, and you're the kid who saved him by never giving up. Your dad talks about you all the time." Jake watched the 4 kids disappear toward the treehouse, and Laura moved to stand beside him. "They're going to be fine," she observed. "All of them. We worried so much about the trauma, about lasting damage. But kids are resilient in ways adults forget." "I'm starting to figure that out," Jake agreed. Emma joined them, holding a tray of lemonade, and for a moment the 3 of them stood together watching the party unfold. An ex-wife, a woman Jake had known for exactly one night 6 months ago, and Jake himself, 3 people thrown together by crisis and choosing to build something positive from it. "This is nice," Emma said quietly. "All of us here, celebrating. It feels right." "It does," Laura agreed. Then with a mischievous glance at Jake, "Though I should warn you, Emma, Jake cries at birthday parties. I've seen it." "He always did," Emma confirmed, and Jake realized with horror that they were ganging up on him. "I do not cry at birthday parties," he protested. "You're tearing up right now," Laura pointed out. Jake touched his face and found she was right. "Damn it. That's just allergies or dust from the construction." Both women laughed, and the sound was so warm and genuine that Jake found himself laughing too. This was his life now. This strange patchwork family assembled from wreckage and second chances. It wasn't what he'd planned, wasn't what he'd expected, but it was real and present and more valuable than anything he'd lost. As the afternoon wore down and kids started getting picked up by their parents, Cody pulled Jake and Laura aside. "Can I ask you guys something?" "Sure, buddy," Jake said. "Mom's been talking about starting a foundation, something to help veterans and families affected by violence. She said she wants to use what happened to us to help other people." Cody looked between them earnestly. "Would you guys help? All 3 of you?" Jake glanced at Laura, who looked as surprised as he felt. "Your mom didn't mention this to me," Laura said. "Because I wanted Cody to ask," Emma said, appearing behind them. "It feels more appropriate coming from him. But yes, I've been thinking about it for months. Using our experience, all of our experiences, to create something positive. Support for veterans dealing with PTSD and addiction, resources for domestic violence survivors, maybe even advocacy for better mental health care." She paused. "But it only works if we do it together. All of us." Jake felt his throat tighten. "Emma, I don't know if I'm the right person to be the face of something like that. My history—" "Your history is exactly why you're the right person," Emma interrupted. "You've lived through the worst of it and come out the other side. You understand what veterans need because you've needed it yourself. And you've proven that recovery is possible, that people can rebuild." "I think it's a beautiful idea," Laura said softly, "and I'd be honored to be part of it." They talked for another hour after the last guest had left, sitting around Emma's kitchen table while Cody played in his new treehouse. They discussed possibilities and challenges, resources and contacts. Emma had clearly been researching this for months, and her ideas were thorough and well considered. A foundation that could provide immediate support to veterans in crisis, funding for therapy and treatment programs, advocacy work to improve the systems that had failed so many. "We could call it Second Chances," Laura suggested, "or the Open Door Foundation." "The Mason Project," Emma countered, glancing at Jake. "Named after the place where everything changed." Jake felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were proposing, but also energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. This was purpose beyond just survival. This was taking the worst night of his life and transforming it into something that could help hundreds, maybe thousands, of people facing similar darkness. "I'm in," he said. "Whatever you need from me, I'm in." They sealed the commitment with a handshake that turned into a group hug, and Jake marveled at the strange path that had led him here. From the barrel of a gun pressed against his temple to a kitchen table surrounded by people planning how to save others from the same despair, the journey was almost too improbable to believe. But it had happened. It was happening, and Jake was determined to make the most of every impossible second. 1 year after that Christmas Eve, when Jake's life had been measured in seconds before the knock came, he stood at a podium in a Denver hotel ballroom facing 200 people who'd gathered for the inaugural fundraising gala of the Open Door Foundation. His hands were sweating despite the air conditioning, and the speech he'd practiced a dozen times suddenly felt inadequate for the moment. But Emma was in the front row with Cody. Laura sat beside them with Sophie and Maya, and scattered throughout the audience were faces from his AA meetings, his PTSD support group, veterans he'd connected with through the foundation's early outreach efforts. People who knew his story not from news reports, but from lived experience. He cleared his throat and began. "A year ago tonight, I was sitting in my grandfather's cabin with a loaded gun and a letter to my son, convinced that the world would be better off without me in it. I'd lost my business, my marriage, my sense of purpose. I was drowning in PTSD and addiction, and I couldn't see any way forward, so I decided there wasn't going to be a forward." Jake paused, letting the words settle. "But then 3 strangers knocked on my door in a snowstorm, and everything changed." He told them the story, not the sanitized version that had appeared in news articles, but the real one. The desperation in Laura's voice, the terror in her daughter's eyes. The moment when he'd had to choose between finishing what he'd started or fighting for 3 lives that weren't his own. The firefight that had left 5 men dead and Jake bleeding on his grandfather's floor, certain he was dying but somehow okay with it, because at least he'd mattered one last time. "I didn't save Laura and Sophie and Maya because I was brave," Jake said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I saved them because something in me, some last remaining piece that hadn't been destroyed by war and addiction, couldn't let them die. And in saving them, they saved me right back. They gave me a reason to keep breathing when I'd run out of reasons." He looked at Laura, who was crying openly, and at Emma, who clutched Cody's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The Open Door Foundation exists because of what happened that night. Because we, Laura, Emma, myself, and so many others who've joined this effort, believe that no veteran should face their darkest moment alone. No family should have to knock on doors desperately hoping someone will answer. No one should feel so broken that death seems like the only option. Jake's voice strengthened. "We're here to be the door that opens, the voice that answers, the hand that reaches out in the darkness and says, 'You're not alone, and we're going to fight this together.'" The applause started before he'd finished, building to a standing ovation that left Jake simultaneously humbled and energized. He stepped away from the podium and was immediately enveloped by Emma, who hugged him fiercely. "That was perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Laura appeared beside them, mascara running down her face, and pulled Jake into an embrace. "You're going to save so many people," she said, "just like you saved us." The gala raised over $300,000, far more than they'd projected for their first event. Donors ranged from wealthy tech executives moved by Laura's corporate connections to working-class families who'd scraped together $50 because they'd lost someone to suicide and wished something like the open door had existed. By the end of the evening, they had commitments from 3 major mental health organizations to partner with them, pledges from a dozen therapists to provide reduced-cost services to veterans, and inquiries from 5 other cities interested in replicating their model. Jake spent hours talking to donors and volunteers, shaking hands and sharing abbreviated versions of his story so many times the words started to feel rehearsed. But every person who approached him had their own story too. A brother who'd come home from Iraq changed, a father who'd struggled with PTSD for decades, a friend who'd been found dead with a gun in his hand, and a note that said he just couldn't do it anymore. The need was vast and desperate, and for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was part of something that actually mattered on a scale beyond just his own survival. Near the end of the evening, an older woman approached him hesitantly. She was small and gray-haired, with eyes that had seen too much grief. "Mr. Mason, I'm Carol Henderson. My son, David, was a Marine. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, same as you. Came home with PTSD, struggled for years, couldn't hold down a job or maintain relationships." Her voice wavered. "He killed himself 3 years ago. Left a note that said he was sorry for being such a burden." Jake's chest constricted. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I came tonight because I heard your story and I thought..." Carol's tears spilled over. "I thought if something like this foundation had existed 3 years ago, if David had known there were other veterans fighting the same battles, if he'd had somewhere to turn when things got dark, maybe he'd still be here." Jake didn't have words adequate for that kind of pain, so he simply pulled her into a hug and let her cry against his shoulder. When she finally pulled back, she pressed a check into his hand. "This is everything I can spare," she said. "It's not much, but I want you to use it to save someone else's son, someone else's David. Promise me you'll keep doing this work. Promise me his death won't be meaningless." Jake looked at the check, $5,000, probably her entire savings, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. "I promise," he said hoarsely. "I promise we'll do everything we can." After Carol walked away, Jake stood alone for a moment, clutching the check and trying to process the magnitude of what they'd created. The Open Door Foundation wasn't just about him anymore. Wasn't just about Laura and her daughters or Emma and Cody. It was about every David Henderson out there, every veteran sitting in a dark room with a weapon and a belief that the world would be better off without them. It was about changing that narrative one intervention at a time. The foundation's work began in earnest the following week. They'd rented a small office space in downtown Denver and hired 2 full-time staff members, a veteran advocate named Sarah Chen, who'd done similar work for other nonprofits, and a licensed therapist named Dr. Michael Torres, who specialized in PTSD and addiction. Jake split his time between the construction business and the foundation, finding that the two complemented each other in unexpected ways. Building things with his hands kept him grounded, while the foundation work gave him purpose that extended beyond just earning a living. Their first major initiative was a 24-hour crisis hotline specifically for veterans. They partnered with the Veterans Crisis Line, but offered something additional. Every call was answered by someone who'd actually served, who understood military culture and combat trauma from lived experience rather than textbooks. Jake took shifts on the hotline twice a week, usually late at night when the calls were most frequent and most desperate. The first call he took was from a former Army Ranger named David, the same name as Carol Henderson's son, which felt like both coincidence and fate. David was in his truck with a gun, parked outside his ex-wife's house, trying to decide if he had the courage to end it. "I'm just so tired," David said, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Tired of the nightmares? Tired of disappointing everyone? Tired of feeling like I'm watching my life through a window instead of actually living it?" Jake recognized every word because he'd thought them all himself a year ago. "I know that tired," he said quietly. "I know it so well I could write a book about it. But David, listen to me. That tired isn't permanent. It feels permanent right now, in this moment, but it's not." "How do you know?" "Because I was where you are exactly 1 year ago. Gun in my hand, letter written, convinced there was no other option. But I was wrong. And the only reason I'm here to tell you that is because someone knocked on my door at exactly the right moment and gave me a reason to put the gun down." They talked for 2 hours. Jake shared his story in detail, and David shared his: divorce, custody battle, untreated PTSD that manifested as rage and paranoia, mounting debt for medical bills and legal fees, the kind of slow-motion collapse that looked inevitable until someone offered a different perspective. "What if I can't do it?" David asked finally, the gun still in his lap, but his voice sounding less certain. "What if I try to get better and I fail?" "Then you try again," Jake said. "And if you fail again, you try again after that. Recovery isn't a straight line, man. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. But the alternative," his voice caught, "the alternative is you don't get to see if it works out. You don't get to meet the person you could become once you get through this." By the end of the call, David had agreed to check himself into the VA hospital's psychiatric unit. Jake stayed on the line while David drove there, talking him through his fear and doubt, and only hung up once he confirmed that David was being admitted. Then Jake sat in the quiet office and cried. For David, for Carol Henderson's son, for the thousands of veterans out there who were one bad night away from a permanent decision. But he also felt something else. Hope. Because David was getting help. Because the hotline had worked exactly as intended. Because maybe, just maybe, they could actually make a difference. The foundation grew rapidly. Within 3 months, they'd expanded to include weekly support groups at 5 different locations across Colorado, a partnership program that connected struggling veterans with mentors who'd been through similar experiences, and a grant fund that helped cover the cost of therapy for veterans whose insurance was inadequate. Laura leveraged her corporate connections to secure donations and sponsorships. Emma handled the administrative and legal complexities, and Jake became the public face, the living proof that recovery was possible. He spoke at VA hospitals, community centers, military bases. He shared his story over and over, each telling getting easier, even as the emotions remained raw. And after every speech, veterans approached him with their own stories, their own struggles, their own desperate need for someone to tell them it was going to be okay. Jake met Marcus for coffee every week, the Army Ranger who'd approached him after his first PTSD support group meeting. Marcus had become one of the Foundation's most effective peer mentors, using his own journey from suicidal despair to stable recovery as a roadmap for others. They talked about their work, their progress, the veterans they were helping, and the ones they'd lost despite their best efforts. "I got a call last night," Marcus said during one of their meetings, his expression troubled. Former Marine, 3 tours, 2 kids, said he was planning to do it this weekend, had everything arranged, but he called the hotline first just to, say goodbye to someone who'd understand, maybe. "What happened?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "I talked him down, convinced him to go to the emergency room instead. He's in the psych ward now, getting the help he needs." Marcus stirred his coffee absently. "But Jake, man, we can't save them all. There are so many, and we're just a small foundation with limited resources. How do we live with the ones we don't reach in time?" It was a question Jake had been wrestling with himself. For every David they helped, for every veteran who called the hotline and accepted intervention, there were others who never made that call. Others who chose silence and isolation over reaching out. Others who died alone because they didn't know help existed or didn't believe they deserved it. "We live with it by saving the ones we can," Jake said finally, "and by building something that outlasts us. Every veteran we help, they go on to help others. It compounds, it spreads. Maybe we can't save everyone today, but we can create a system that saves more people tomorrow." "That's a lot of faith in tomorrow," Marcus observed. "Yeah, well, a year ago I didn't think I'd have a tomorrow. So I'm kind of invested in making sure other people get theirs. Cody's baseball season ended with his team making the playoffs, and Jake attended every single game, cheering from the stands, helping with post-game celebrations, being present in a way he'd never managed before his own crisis. When Cody hit a game-winning single in the championship game, Jake's pride was so overwhelming he had to step away from the bleachers to compose himself. "You okay, Dad?" Cody asked afterward, still in his grass-stained uniform. "Yeah, buddy. Just really proud of you. Not just for the hit, but for everything. For being such a good kid despite having a dad who was pretty messed up for a while." Cody considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "You weren't messed up, Dad. You were hurt. There's a difference. When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't around to notice." Cody grinned to show he was mostly joking. "But you're around now, and that's what matters." Emma had started dating someone, a teacher at Cody's school named Robert, who seemed kind and stable and everything Emma deserved. Jake met him at a parent-teacher conference and felt a complicated mix of emotions: jealousy that someone else got to be part of Emma's life, relief that she was moving forward, gratitude that Cody would have a good male role model even during the times he wasn't with Jake. "You okay with this?" Emma asked later, after Robert had left and Jake was helping her clean up from Cody's birthday party. "With me seeing someone?" "I want you to be happy," Jake said honestly. "We're not getting back together, and I've made peace with that. If Robert makes you happy, then I'm glad you found him." "He's good with Cody," Emma said. "Patient, attentive, nothing like—" She stopped herself. "Nothing like I was," Jake finished. "It's okay, Emma. You can say it. I was a terrible husband, especially toward the end. You deserve better than what I gave you." "You weren't terrible. You were sick." Emma touched his arm gently. "And you got better. That's what matters. You got better, and you're being an amazing father now, and you're helping other people get better too. I'm proud of you, Jake. Genuinely proud." The words healed something Jake hadn't realized was still wounded. Emma's pride, Emma's forgiveness. He'd spent years believing he'd forfeited any right to those things. Hearing them now, standing in her kitchen a year after he'd almost permanently removed himself from the world, felt like the final piece clicking into place. Laura had also started rebuilding her romantic life, though more cautiously. She went on occasional dates that Sophie and Maya vetted with the seriousness of Secret Service agents, but nothing had developed into anything serious. When Jake asked her about it during one of their weekly coffee meetings, she shrugged philosophically. "I'm in no rush," she said. "The girls and I are still healing from everything that happened. We're still learning how to feel safe in the world again. Adding a relationship to that seems complicated." "But you're open to it eventually?" "Eventually, sure, but right now I'm focused on being present for my daughters and doing meaningful work with the foundation. That feels like enough." The foundation celebrated its 6-month anniversary with a small gathering at the office. They'd helped over 300 veterans access mental health services, answered thousands of crisis hotline calls, and established peer support groups in 10 cities across 3 states. The local news ran a feature story about their work, centering on Jake's transformation from suicidal veteran to advocate for others facing similar darkness. The story aired on a Tuesday evening, and Jake's phone exploded with messages. Old friends from the Marines reaching out to say they'd struggled too and were grateful someone was talking about it publicly. Veterans he'd never met thanking him for giving voice to experiences they'd thought were theirs alone. And one message that made him cry in the privacy of his truck. Carol Henderson, saying that watching the story had helped her feel connected to her son's memory in a way that brought comfort instead of just pain. But the message that surprised him most came from an unknown number. "Jake, it's Laura Bennett. Different phone, different life, but same gratitude. I'm so proud of what you've built. You've turned your darkest moment into light for so many others. That's not redemption, that's transformation. Love from all 3 of us." Jake saved the message and read it whenever doubt crept in, whenever the weight of responsibility felt too heavy, whenever he questioned whether any of this mattered. Laura's words reminded him that transformation was possible, that darkness could be alchemized into light, that the worst night of his life had somehow become the catalyst for the best work of his life. 18 months after Christmas Eve, Jake received a call from Dr. Torres asking him to come to the office immediately. He arrived to find a young Marine named Tyler sitting in the conference room, barely 23 years old, with hollow eyes and a discharge letter from the psychiatric ward crumpled in his fist. Tyler called the hotline last night, Dr. Torres explained. He's been in crisis for weeks. We got him admitted to the VA hospital, but they're releasing him today with a prescription and an appointment in 2 weeks. He has nowhere to go, no support system, and I'm concerned about his safety. Jake looked at Tyler and saw himself 2 years ago, broken, alone, convinced that surviving wasn't worth the effort it required. Tyler, he said gently, I'm Jake Mason. I run this foundation, and I want you to know something. You're not leaving here without a plan. We're going to figure this out together. They spent 3 hours building a safety net. Jake connected Tyler with a peer mentor who was also a young Marine veteran. They arranged temporary housing through a partner organization. They scheduled daily check-ins with the crisis hotline team. They created a crisis plan for when the suicidal thoughts became overwhelming, complete with phone numbers and specific interventions Tyler had agreed to try before taking any irreversible action. Why are you doing this? Tyler asked as Jake was preparing to leave. You don't know me. Why do you care if I live or die? Jake sat back down and met the young man's haunted eyes. Because 2 years ago I was exactly where you are. Gun in my hand, convinced dying was easier than living. But someone knocked on my door and gave me a reason to choose differently, and now I'm knocking on yours. What if I can't do it? What if I'm too broken? Then we'll help you figure out how to function while broken, Jake said. Recovery isn't about being perfect or fixed. It's about learning to live with the damage while slowly, gradually building something better. And you don't have to do it alone. Tyler started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that spoke of months or years of held-back emotion. Jake just sat with him, offering tissues and presents and the kind of understanding that could only come from having walked the same dark path. Over the following weeks, Jake checked in with Tyler regularly. There were setbacks. Nights when Tyler called the crisis line at 2 a.m, days when getting out of bed felt impossible, moments when the gun Tyler had surrendered to the VA called to him like a siren song. But there were also victories. Tyler attended his first support group meeting and actually spoke. He started therapy with a trauma specialist. He got a part-time job at a hardware store and discovered he was good with customers. 3 months after their first meeting, Tyler showed up at the foundation office with a young woman he introduced as his sister. I wanted her to meet you, Tyler said. She's been trying to get me help for over a year, but I kept refusing. I want her to know that I'm finally doing it, that I'm trying. Jake shook the sister's hand and saw tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my brother. He's saving himself, Jake said. I'm just walking beside him while he does it. But after they left, Dr. Torres pulled Jake aside. You know that's not entirely true, right? Tyler wouldn't be here without you, without this foundation. You're saving people, Jake. Literally saving lives every single day. Jake thought about Carol Henderson's son, about all the veterans they hadn't reached in time, about the impossibility of saving everyone. Not everyone, he said quietly. No, not everyone. But everyone you do save, that's someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father who gets another chance. That matters. Even if you can't save them all, the ones you do save matter infinitely. The second anniversary of that Christmas Eve approached with a mix of emotion Jake struggled to articulate. 2 years since he'd sat with a gun and a letter, ready to exit permanently. 2 years of sobriety, therapy, hard work, and incremental healing. 2 years of learning how to live again instead of just surviving. The foundation organized a memorial event for veterans lost to suicide, a candlelight vigil in a Denver park where families could come and remember, where veterans could gather and commit to choosing life for one more day. Jake stood at the front holding a candle for Carol Henderson's son David, and around him stood 200 other people holding their own flames, their own memories, their own determination to keep fighting. Laura spoke at the vigil, her voice clear and strong as she shared her perspective as someone who'd witnessed Jake's transformation. 2 years ago, my daughters and I knocked on a door in a snowstorm, desperate for shelter. The man who answered was seconds from ending his own life, but he chose to fight for us instead. And in fighting for us, he saved himself. She paused, her candle flickering in the evening breeze. That's what we're all here to do, fight for each other when fighting for ourselves feels impossible. Be the door that opens when someone knocks. Be the light in someone else's darkness. Sophie and Maya stood beside their mother, now 12 and 9 respectively, holding candles and remembering the night that had changed all their lives. They'd grown in the 2 years since Christmas Eve, not just physically but emotionally, transforming from terrified children into resilient young people who understood survival and strength in ways most kids never had to. After the vigil, families mingled and shared stories. Jake met a widow whose husband had killed himself after 3 deployments to Iraq. He met a father whose daughter had survived a suicide attempt and was now thriving in recovery. He met teenagers who'd lost parents to PTSD-related suicides and were struggling to make sense of the loss. Each story was different, but underneath they all shared the same theme: love, loss, and the desperate hope that talking about it openly might prevent the next tragedy. Cody, now 12 and shooting up in height, stood beside Jake during these conversations. He'd become the Foundation's unofficial mascot, the kid who'd never given up on his dad, who'd kept believing even when belief seemed foolish. Emma had worried about exposing him to so much pain and trauma, but Cody had insisted on being involved, said he wanted to help other kids who had parents struggling like his dad had struggled. "Mr. Mason?" A teenage girl approached hesitantly, her mother trailing behind. "I'm Ashley. I heard you speak at my school last month about PTSD and suicide prevention." "I remember," Jake said warmly. "You asked about how families could help veterans who wouldn't accept help." "My dad," Ashley's voice cracked. "He's a veteran. Afghanistan. And he's been really struggling lately. He won't talk to anyone, won't go to therapy, just drinks and isolates himself. I'm scared he's going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jake crouched down to her eye level, his heart breaking for this kid who carried burdens no teenager should have to carry. "Is your dad here tonight?" "No, he wouldn't come. Said it was stupid that talking about feelings doesn't help." "Okay, that's okay." Jake pulled out his wallet and extracted a card. "This has my personal cell phone number on it. I want you to give it to your dad. Tell him a Marine who's been where he is wants to talk. No pressure, no judgment. If he calls, I'll answer. If he doesn't, that's okay too. But make sure he knows the option exists." Ashley took the card with trembling hands. "What if he won't call? What if he—" "Then you call me," Jake interrupted gently. "If you think your dad is in immediate danger, if you see signs that he's planning something, you call me day or night and I will personally come to your house and intervene. That's a promise." The mother was crying now, and she pulled Jake into a fierce hug. "Thank you. God, thank you. We've been so alone with this, so scared, and no one seems to understand." "You're not alone anymore," Jake said firmly. "That's why this foundation exists, so no one has to face this alone." 3 days later, Ashley's father called. His name was James, and he was drunk when he dialed Jake's number at 11 at night. "My daughter gave me your number," he slurred. "Said you're some kind of hero Marine who fought off killers and saved people." "I'm not a hero," Jake said, settling into his chair for what he knew would be a long conversation. "I'm just a guy who almost killed himself 2 years ago and got lucky enough to have someone knock on my door at the right moment." "How are you doing tonight, James?" They talked until 3 in the morning. James shared his combat experiences, his struggles with hypervigilance and rage, his failed attempts to numb the pain with alcohol, his growing conviction that his family would be better off without him. Jake listened and shared his own parallel experiences, the dark humor that only veterans understood, the specific nightmares that civilians could never comprehend. "How did you get better?" James asked finally, his voice raw from hours of talking. "If you did get better, did you really, or are you just good at pretending?" "Both," Jake admitted. "Some days I'm genuinely okay, sober, stable, grateful to be alive. Other days I'm white-knuckling it, using every tool I've learned in therapy just to get through the next hour. But even on the worst days, I'm glad I'm still here, because the good days are worth surviving the bad ones." "I don't have good days anymore." "You will," Jake said with certainty. "Not immediately, not magically, but gradually. If you commit to the work, real therapy, sobriety, support groups, all of it, you'll start having moments that don't suck, then hours, then whole days. And eventually you'll realize you're actually living again instead of just surviving. James agreed to come to the foundation's office the next day. Jake met him there along with Dr. Torres, and they built a treatment plan similar to the one they'd created for Tyler. Peer support, therapy, crisis resources, daily check-ins. James was resistant at first, defensive and dismissive, but Ashley's presence softened him. His daughter had taken the day off school to be there, and the look in her eyes, desperate hope mixed with exhausted fear, was enough to crack through James's armor. "I don't want you to worry about me like this," James said to his daughter, his voice breaking. "You should be thinking about boyfriends and homework, not whether your dad's going to be alive tomorrow." Then get help," Ashley said simply, "so I can go back to worrying about normal things." James entered an intensive outpatient treatment program the following week. It wasn't a perfect recovery. There were missed appointments, moments of resistance, setbacks that made everyone question whether it would work. But James kept showing up, kept trying, and 6 months later, he stood at a foundation event as a peer mentor himself, sharing his story to inspire others who were where he'd been. "My daughter saved my life by refusing to give up on me," James said to the assembled crowd. "And Jake and this foundation gave me the tools to save myself. If you're sitting here tonight thinking you're too far gone, thinking there's no way back, you're wrong. I was wrong too. But here I am anyway." The foundation's impact rippled outward in ways Jake couldn't have predicted. Veterans they'd helped went on to help others. Family members connected through support groups and built informal networks of care. The model they'd created in Colorado was being replicated in other states, with foundation chapters opening in Arizona, Texas, and Virginia. They'd been featured in a documentary about veteran suicide prevention and had received a grant from the Department of Veterans Affairs to expand their crisis hotline services. But the moment that mattered most to Jake came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when he was working at a job site. His phone rang with an unknown number, and he almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. "Is this Jake Mason?" A woman's voice, hesitant and nervous. "Yes, this is Jake. My name is David Miller. Well, Diane Miller, but everyone calls me David. I called your crisis hotline 6 months ago. I was in my truck with a gun and you talked me down. Convinced me to check into the VA hospital." Jake felt his heart rate spike as the memory came back. The Army Ranger who'd been drunk and suicidal parked outside his ex-wife's house. One of the first calls Jake had taken on the hotline. "I remember. How are you?" "I'm 6 months sober," David said, and Jake could hear tears in his voice. "I'm in therapy. I'm working again. I'm rebuilding my relationship with my kids. And I wanted to call and tell you that I'm alive because of you. Because you took my call that night and didn't give up on me." Jake had to sit down, the impact of those words hitting him like a physical force. "David, I'm so glad you called. So proud of the work you've been doing. I'm going to be a peer mentor," David continued. "I'm training with your foundation next month. I want to do for other people what you did for me. Be the voice on the other end of the line that says, 'Hold on, it gets better.'" After they hung up, Jake sat in his truck and cried. Not from sadness or pain, but from overwhelming gratitude that he'd survived long enough to take that call. That he'd opened the door 2 years ago instead of pulling the trigger. That Laura and Sophie and Maya had knocked when they did. Everything, all of it, the pain and the healing and the hard work of recovery, had been leading to that phone call from David. To the knowledge that his survival had created space for someone else's survival. That the choice he'd made in desperation had cascaded forward into hope for someone he'd never met. The third Christmas after that fateful night arrived with snow and celebration. Jake hosted dinner at the cabin for an eclectic gathering that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. Emma and Robert, Cody, Laura and her daughters, Marcus and his wife, Dr. Torres and his family, Tyler and his sister, James and Ashley. The cabin that had almost been his tomb was filled with laughter and warmth, and the kind of chaotic joy that comes from bringing together people who've all survived something hard and chosen to build something better. "I want to propose a toast," Laura said, standing at the head of the table with a glass of sparkling cider. 3 years ago, my daughters and I knocked on a door in a snowstorm. The man who answered was in his darkest moment, but he chose to fight for us anyway. And in doing so, he saved 4 lives, ours and his own. 4 lives that have gone on to touch hundreds of others, Emma added. Through the foundation, through the work Jake does every day, through the example he sets for all of us about what recovery and redemption actually look like. To Jake, Marcus said, raising his glass. To second chances, Tyler added. To open doors, Sophie said with a grin. They all raised their glasses, and Jake felt his throat close with emotion. He looked around the table at these people who'd become his family through crisis and choice, and he understood something profound. This was what redemption looked like. Not a single heroic act, not a dramatic transformation, but the daily work of showing up for yourself and others. The accumulation of small choices that added up to a life worth living. I have something I want to share, Jake said, his voice rough. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Not the suicide note he'd written 3 years ago, which had been destroyed, but a new letter he'd written the night before. This is a letter to Cody, but I want to read it to all of you. He unfolded the paper and began, Dear Cody, 3 years ago I wrote you a goodbye letter. I told you I loved you, that none of our problems were your fault, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is give up. I was wrong about that last part. Giving up isn't strong. It's final. And in being final, it eliminates every possibility of things getting better. 3 years ago, I thought I knew how the story ended, but I was wrong about that too. The story didn't end in that cabin with a gun and a letter. It pivoted, it transformed. It became something I never could have imagined in my darkest moment. I became someone I never thought possible. Not perfect, not healed, but functional and useful and genuinely grateful to be alive. I say all this because I want you to understand something important. Whatever darkness you face in your life, whatever moments when giving up seems easier than continuing, remember that you don't know how the story ends. None of us do. We think we do, but we're usually wrong. The strongest thing you can do is stay alive long enough to find out what happens next. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. Thank you for being the kind of son who kept believing his father could be better. I'm spending the rest of my life trying to live up to that belief. I love you more than words can say. Dad. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Cody got up and hugged his father fiercely, and Jake held him tight, grateful beyond measure that he was here to do so. That Christmas Eve knock on the door had saved 4 lives directly, but the ripples had extended far beyond that, to David Miller, to Tyler, to James, to Ashley, to Carol Henderson finding peace, to hundreds of veterans who'd called the crisis hotline and chosen to stay alive. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and only Laura and her daughters remained, they sat by the fireplace in comfortable silence. The same fireplace that had been dying to embers 3 years ago, the same room that had been a stage for near tragedy and actual heroism. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't knocked? Sophie asked quietly. If we'd gone to a different house, or if we'd frozen in the snow, or if you hadn't answered? Jake considered this carefully. Sometimes. But thinking about alternate timelines doesn't help anyone. What matters is what actually happened. You knocked, I answered. We all survived. And we've spent the last 3 years building something meaningful from that night. I'm glad we knocked on your door, Maya said. Even though it was scary. Even though people died. Because you became our friend, and you started the foundation, and you help people now. I'm glad you knocked too, Jake said softly. More than you'll ever know. Laura met his eyes across the firelight, and in that look was acknowledgement of everything they'd been through together and everything they'd become. Not romantic, not familial, but something uniquely theirs. 2 people who'd saved each other in a moment of crisis and had chosen to honor that salvation by living fully, purposefully, in service of others facing similar darkness. I should ask you something, Laura said. The foundation has been approached by a national veterans organization. They want to expand our model nationwide, provide funding and infrastructure to create open-door chapters in every state. It would mean traveling, speaking engagements, probably less time for the construction business. Are you ready for that? Jake thought about his grandfather's cabin, about the gun he'd almost used, about the letter that had outlined a story that never happened. And he thought about David Miller and Tyler and James and all the veterans yet to come who needed someone to tell them that survival was possible, that recovery was real, that darkness could be transformed into light. Yeah, he said, I'm ready. The expansion happened over the following year. Jake traveled to 20 states helping establish open-door foundation chapters. training peer mentors, sharing his story with thousands of veterans and their families. It was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure, but he never lost sight of why he was doing it, because every veteran saved was someone's son or daughter, someone's parent or sibling, someone who mattered infinitely to the people who loved them. He maintained his sobriety through the travel and stress, attending AA meetings in every city he visited. He kept up with therapy via video calls when he couldn't make in-person appointments. He called Cody 3 times a week without fail and made it home for every important event, baseball games, school concerts, birthday parties. The balance was precarious, but Jake had learned that recovery meant constant vigilance, constant choice, constant commitment to doing the hard thing instead of the easy thing. On the 5th anniversary of that Christmas Eve, the Open Door Foundation held a gala in Washington, D.C. 500 people attended, veterans, families, donors, politicians who'd been moved by the foundation's work. Jake stood at the podium wearing a suit Emma had helped him pick out, looking at an audience that included Dr. Torres, Marcus, Tyler, James, Ashley, David Miller, who'd flown in from California, and dozens of other veterans the foundation had helped over the years. And in the front row, together like they'd planned it, sat the 3 people who'd started everything. Emma with Cody on one side and Robert on the other, and Laura with Sophie and Maya flanking her like fierce guards. 5 years ago tonight, Jake began, his voice steady and strong, I was sitting in my grandfather's cabin in Colorado, holding a gun and a letter, convinced that suicide was the strongest choice I could make. I was wrong. The strongest choice I could make was opening the door when 3 strangers knocked. Everything that's happened since, every life saved, every veteran connected to resources, every family given hope, it all traces back to that moment when I chose to answer instead of to end things. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle over the ballroom. The Open Door Foundation has helped over 10,000 veterans in 5 years. We've answered 50,000 crisis calls. We've prevented countless suicides and connected struggling veterans with the support they need to rebuild their lives. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Behind every statistic is a person, someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend who gets another chance at life because we were there when they reached out. Jake looked directly at Laura, at the woman who'd knocked on his door in a snowstorm and given him a reason to keep breathing. I'm standing here tonight because of 3 people who refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. Because they taught me that survival isn't selfish. It's the foundation for everything else. You can't help anyone if you're dead. You can't make amends, can't rebuild relationships, can't become the person you were meant to be if you take that permanent exit. He shared stories from the past 5 years, David Miller, who'd become a peer mentor himself and had personally helped 20 veterans through crisis. Tyler, who'd graduated college and was now a social worker specializing in trauma. James, who'd reconciled with his daughter and was celebrating 2 years of sobriety. The widow who'd turned her husband's suicide into advocacy work that had changed VA policies. The teenager whose father had called the hotline and was now coaching his son's baseball team. Every single one of these stories exists because someone chose to open a door, Jake said, because someone answered the phone at 2 a.m, because someone said, you matter, and I'm going to prove it to you by not giving up. That's what the Open Door Foundation is, a promise that when you reach out in your darkest moment, someone will be there to answer. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Jake stood at the podium with tears running down his face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd built from one impossible night. When the applause finally died down, he was joined on stage by Laura, Emma, Marcus, Dr. Torres, and Cody, the core team that had transformed personal tragedy into collective hope. We're not done, Jake told the audience. There are still veterans out there who don't know help exists, still families suffering in silence, still communities that stigmatize mental health struggles instead of supporting recovery. But we're going to keep fighting for them. We're going to keep opening doors, because that's what we do. We answer when someone knocks. After the gala, the core team gathered in Jake's hotel suite, not for celebration so much as reflection. They'd come so far from that Christmas Eve 5 years ago, built something that had taken on a life of its own, grown beyond anything they'd imagined. I never thought we'd get this big, Emma admitted, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. When we started planning the foundation at Cody's birthday party, I thought maybe we'd help a few dozen veterans locally, not 10,000 people across the country. It's because the need is so vast, Dr. Torres said. 22 veterans a day die by suicide. That's the official number, but we know it's probably higher. The Open Door Foundation isn't solving the crisis. It's providing a lifeline for people who are drowning. That's important work, even if it can't save everyone. I heard from Carol Henderson last week, Jake said quietly. The woman whose son David killed himself before we started the foundation. She volunteers at our Denver chapter now, answering the crisis hotline. She said that helping other people's sons gives her a way to honor David's memory. That's beautiful, Laura said, and Jake saw her wipe away tears, turning pain into purpose. That's what we're all doing, really. Cody, now 15 and tall enough to look his father in the eye, spoke up from his spot by the window. Can I say something? Of course, buddy, Jake said. I used to be really angry at you, Dad, for all the years you were sick, for missing stuff, for making Mom cry. I thought you were weak for not being able to handle your problems. Cody's voice was steady, mature beyond his years. But watching you build the foundation, watching you help all these other veterans, I get it now. You weren't weak, you were hurt, and you didn't have the tools to heal, and now you're making sure other people have those tools. That's not weak, that's strong. Jake crossed the room and pulled his son into a hug, overwhelmed by gratitude that he'd survived long enough to hear those words. That he'd opened the door 5 years ago instead of pulling the trigger. That Cody had grown up with a father who'd chosen recovery over resignation. Thank you, Jake whispered against his son's hair. Thank you for never giving up on me. That's what family does, Cody replied simply. We don't give up on each other. The following morning, Jake woke early and went for a run along the National Mall. The sun was just rising, painting the monuments in shades of gold and pink, and Jake felt profoundly at peace. His shoulder still ached sometimes, especially in cold weather, and his burned hand had permanent nerve damage that made fine motor tasks challenging. But these were badges of survival, proof that he'd fought and won when winning had seemed impossible. He thought about the gun he'd held 5 years ago, about how close he'd come to never experiencing any of this. The foundation, the recovered relationship with Cody, the friendships with Laura and Marcus and Tyler, the thousands of lives touched by their work. It had all hinged on one moment, one choice, one knock at the door that he'd chosen to answer instead of ignore. Jake stopped running and stood looking at the Lincoln Memorial, at the massive figure of a president who'd led the country through its darkest hour and had suffered from depression himself. History was full of people who'd fought through darkness to create light, who'd transformed personal pain into public good. Jake wasn't comparing himself to Lincoln. That would be absurd, but he understood the principle now. That suffering wasn't meaningless if you could alchemize it into something that helped others. That surviving was just the first step. The real work was what you did with the survival. His phone buzzed with a text from Laura. Coffee before we fly home? I want to talk about the next phase of expansion. Jake smiled and typed back. Absolutely. Meet you in the lobby in an hour. Another text arrived, this one from the crisis hotline. Busy night. 7 calls, all successfully connected to resources. One veteran in particular wanted us to thank you personally. Said your story gave him permission to ask for help. Jake stared at that message for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle over him. 7 calls. 7 people who'd reached out in crisis and been met with support instead of silence. 7 lives potentially saved because he and Laura and Emma had transformed one terrible night into a system of care and hope. He thought about the letter he'd written to Cody 3 years ago, about staying alive long enough to see how the story ended. But he understood now that stories didn't really end. They just kept unfolding, moment by moment, choice by choice, into futures that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The story that had started with a gun and a knock at the door had evolved into something far bigger than Jake's personal redemption. It had become about collective healing, about community, about the radical act of choosing life even when death seemed easier. Jake ran back to the hotel, showered, and met Laura in the lobby for coffee. They talked about expansion plans, about securing additional funding, about training more peer mentors, practical, logistical conversations about the work that needed doing. But underneath it all was the unspoken acknowledgement that they were bound together by that Christmas Eve, that their lives had been permanently altered in ways both terrible and miraculous. Do you ever regret it? Laura asked suddenly. Opening the door that night? If you'd known how much it would change your life, would you still have done it? Jake didn't have to think about his answer. Every single time, without hesitation. Because yes, it changed everything, but it changed everything for the better. I got my son back. I found purpose. I discovered that I could still matter, that my life could still mean something beyond just taking up space. Would I have preferred to learn those lessons without the trauma and the violence? Sure, but we don't get to choose how we learn what we need to learn. That's very philosophical for 7 in the morning, Laura said with a smile. I've had 5 years to think about it, Jake replied. 5 years of therapy and reflection and gradually coming to terms with what happened. And here's what I've figured out. That night saved 4 lives directly. But indirectly? We'll never know the full count. Every veteran who calls the hotline, every family that finds support, every suicide prevented because someone knew help existed, they're all ripples from that one night. And that's humbling and overwhelming and the best possible outcome of what was almost the worst possible night. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping coffee and watching other hotel guests hurry through their mornings. Sophie wants to be a therapist, Laura said finally. She says she wants to help people who've been through trauma, like we were helped. Maya talks about joining the military someday, becoming a medic or a nurse. They took that night and turned it into vocations, into purposes. They're remarkable kids, Jake said. But they learned that from you. You taught them how to take trauma and transform it into strength. We all taught each other, Laura corrected gently. That's what that night was really about. People saving each other, holding each other up when standing alone was impossible. That's the model for everything we've built. Jake nodded, feeling the truth of that in his bones. The Open Door Foundation worked because it was based on mutual support, on veterans helping veterans, on the understanding that survival was a team sport rather than a solo endeavor. No one got through darkness alone. They got through it by reaching out, by accepting help, by choosing connection over isolation. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Jake almost sent it to voicemail, but something made him answer. Is this Jake Mason? A young man's voice, shaky and scared. Yes, this is Jake. My name is Chris. I'm a Marine, 2 tours in Iraq. I'm sitting in my car with my service weapon, and I found your foundation's website, and I don't know what to do. Jake's heart rate spiked, but his voice remained calm and steady. The voice he'd cultivated over 5 years of crisis calls, the voice that said, I've been there and I understand and you're going to be okay. Chris, I'm really glad you called. I'm a Marine too, and I know exactly where you are right now because I was in that exact same place 5 years ago. Can you tell me what's going on? They talked for 40 minutes. Jake missed his flight home, and he didn't care. He stayed on the phone with Chris until the young Marine agreed to drive himself to the VA emergency room, and Jake called ahead to make sure someone would be waiting for him when he arrived. Only after Chris was safely in professional hands did Jake hang up and slump back in his chair, exhausted and exhilarated. Laura had waited with him through the whole call, and now she squeezed his hand. You just saved a life. We saved a life, Jake corrected. The foundation, the website, the resources we've built, that's what gave Chris a place to turn. I was just the voice on the other end of the line. Don't minimize it, Laura said firmly. You were sitting in an airport lobby, about to fly home, and you took that call. You gave 40 minutes of your morning to a stranger in crisis. That matters, Jake. It always matters. They caught a later flight, and Jake spent the trip home thinking about Chris. Another life pulled back from the edge. Another veteran who'd get a chance to recover, to rebuild, to discover that survival was possible even when it didn't feel that way. Another ripple spreading outward from that Christmas Eve 5 years ago when 3 strangers had knocked on a door and a broken man had chosen to answer. When Jake finally made it back to Denver, he drove straight to the cabin. It was late evening, and the mountains were painted in twilight purples and blues. He went inside and stood in the center of the room where he'd almost died, the room where he'd fought for 3 lives and his own, the room that had been both tomb and birthplace depending on which choice he'd made. Jake pulled out his wallet and extracted the 2 pieces of paper he carried always, Cody's drawing that said, "My dad is brave," and Laura's letter from 5 years ago that had told him to live well and be happy. He added a 3rd item, a printed email from Chris sent that afternoon. Mr. Mason, I'm in the VA hospital and they're helping me. I wanted to thank you for answering your phone and for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself. You saved my life today. I'm going to make it count. 3 pieces of paper. 3 reminders of why survival mattered. 3 pieces of evidence that opening doors, literal and metaphorical, could change the trajectory of lives in ways impossible to predict or measure. Jake sat in his grandfather's chair and looked at the space where the gun had been 5 years ago. The drawer was empty now, had been empty for years, would remain empty forever. He'd made his choice that Christmas Eve when Laura knocked, and every day since he'd been making the same choice over and over, to stay alive, to keep fighting, to transform darkness into light, one struggling veteran at a time. His phone rang again, not a crisis call this time, but Cody calling to make sure his dad had made it home safely. "Hey, buddy," Jake answered. "Yeah, I'm home. Sorry about missing the flight this morning." "Mom told me you were helping someone," Cody said. "She said it was important." "It was. A Marine in crisis. He's safe now, getting help." "That's good, Dad. That's really good." Cody paused. "I'm proud of you. For everything. For answering that knock 5 years ago, for building the foundation, for helping people. You're doing important work." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Cody. That means everything to me." After they hung up, Jake sat in the quiet cabin and thought about the strange, impossible journey from suicidal despair to purposeful contentment, about how close he'd come to missing all of this. The foundation, the recovered relationships, the lives saved, the peace he'd finally found with himself. About how one knock at the door had changed not just 4 lives, but thousands, rippling outward in ways he was still discovering. He pulled out his journal and wrote one final entry. 5 years ago tonight, I was ready to die. I saw no future worth surviving for, no hope worth holding on to. But 3 strangers knocked on my door, and I chose to answer. That choice, that single moment of opening instead of closing, has defined everything that came after. The foundation, the recovery, the relationships rebuilt, and new ones formed. All of it traces back to the decision to keep the door open. I'm writing this not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. The story doesn't end here, just like it didn't end that Christmas Eve. It keeps going, keeps evolving, keeps surprising me with possibilities I never imagined. And I'm grateful, so deeply, profoundly grateful, that I stayed alive long enough to see how it unfolds. To anyone reading this who's in their own dark place, who can't see a way forward, who's convinced that ending it is the only option, please keep the door open. Please answer when someone knocks. Please survive long enough to discover that the future you can't imagine might be extraordinary. Because I didn't imagine this. None of this. But here I am anyway, 5 years later, genuinely happy to be alive. It's possible. Recovery is possible. Transformation is possible. You just have to open the door when hope comes knocking. Jake closed the journal and stood, looking around the cabin one last time before heading back to Denver. This place would always carry the weight of that Christmas Eve, would always be the site where everything changed. But it was no longer a monument to near tragedy. It was a reminder of resilience, of the power of choice, of what could be built from the ruins of what was almost lost. He turned off the lights, locked the door, and drove home through the mountain darkness. Tomorrow he'd go back to work at the foundation. Tomorrow he'd answer more crisis calls, mentor more struggling veterans, help more families find hope in the midst of despair. Tomorrow he'd continue the work of transforming his darkest moment into light for others. But tonight, driving home under a sky full of stars, Jake Mason was simply grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful for the knock at the door. Grateful for second chances and open doors and the extraordinary, impossible gift of another day. The story that had almost ended in a cabin with a gun had instead become a story about survival, redemption, and the radical act of choosing life even when death seemed easier. And the best part, the part that still amazed Jake when he let himself think about it, was that the story wasn't over. It was still unfolding, one opened door at a time.